Welcome to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid. A set of conversations about our government, our politics, and the kind of country we aspire to be. And now, here's your host, Edwin Eisendrath, on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk.
Hello, everybody. Happy Easter, happy Passover. It is, wow, it's a holy week for many in this world. Easter and Passover, they remind us that freedom and redemption can triumph over slavery and embitterment. Around the world, Jews gather at Seder dinners to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt and to pray for peace and freedom. In Hebrew, the word for Egypt is Mitzrayim, which means a narrow place. So the holiday teaches that to be free in every generation, we must liberate ourselves, not just from Pharaoh of old, but from our own selfish narrow-mindedness. And around the world, Christians celebrate Easter, the resurrection of Jesus. You know, in ancient Rome, in that world, a world of unchecked power and cruelty, the resurrection was a triumph of not just of faith, but of love over hate, and a reminder that in each human, there is a spark of the divine that cannot be crushed. And so it remains in our time. It is a holy week, a week of hope and renewal. But we don't live in a holy world. Ours is a cruel time, a time that perverts these eternal truths, and we're led by people who market rather than practice faith in a just God. Over in Israel today, right-wing leaders claim a divine right to expand that nation's borders, and in the name of security, to destroy tens of thousands of homes and to displace millions of human beings. Yeah, justice is mine, saith the Lord. What he meant was, justice is mine, it's not yours. Humans are not, I'm sorry, vengeance is mine. Or, pardon me, vengeance is mine. He reserved vengeance to himself. That's not supposed to be our job, right? And in the United States today, right-wing leaders claim a divine providence. In fact, they claim that's behind everything they do, from environmental destruction to their ever-expanding militarism. Over at the Pentagon, Pete Hegseth held a Good Friday prayer service. The invite read, and here I'm going to quote, "Just a friendly reminder, there will be a Protestant service, no Catholic Mass, for Good Friday today at the Pentagon Chapel." What? Hegseth didn't explain why he thought it was appropriate to host a Good Friday service at the Pentagon, or why he thought it was appropriate to do so in a manner that excluded Catholics. This week, Hegseth also fired the Army chaplain without explanation. But in fact, there is an explanation for both. Hegseth's faith, it seems, extends only to white men who share his particular brand of zealotry, a zealous faith that looks not to heaven, but to Donald Trump for guidance. And the Army chaplain is black. Okay, well, I mean, I guess that's it. You know, Catholics don't look at the White House for theological instruction. In fact, in Rome this week, Pope Leo, proudly a Chicago Pope, said this: "We tend to consider ourselves powerful when we dominate, victorious when we destroy our equals, great when we are feared. God has given us an example, not of how to dominate, but how to liberate, not how to destroy life, but how to give it." Yeah. They weren't listening over at the Pentagon. America's warrior ethos seems ripped more from video games than real life. And boy, it was on display this week. Donald Trump, the brave commander-in-chief, took to the airwaves this week to make a national address. He got airtime by all of the broadcast networks because he promised an important announcement about the war. Instead, he spoke for 19 dull minutes and rehashed his social media posts. And look, I mean, while he failed to tell us why we were at war or when it might end, he did make two things very clear. First, he told us Iran's air defenses are gone, obliterated. Our planes now have absolute freedom in the Iranian skies. He told us that on national television in prime time. I guess he didn't tell the Iranians. He just lied because within 2 days, two American planes went down. An A-10 Warthog crashed after being struck by Iranian air defenses. Then an F-15 jet fighter was shot out of the sky over Iran. And a pilot, well, one was rescued, another is still missing. Imagine that. Our president told us we had full control over the skies, and Iranians are shooting the planes out of the skies. The second thing he told us is if Iran didn't end the war and reopen the Straits of Hormuz, and he has given a deadline, interestingly, right after the markets open on Monday, the United States would commit massive war crimes, sending 92 million people back, as he says, to the Stone Age where they belong. That sent me to do a little homework. Do you know that at the start of the Neolithic era, the second Stone Age, the advanced Stone Age, there might have been as many as, get this, 10 million human beings on the whole planet. Turns out Stone Age technology doesn't support 90 million lives. So what is Trump really promising in our name? Mass murder, war crimes, to quote the president, like you've never seen before. That is a hell of a rogues gallery he wants to be part of. This week, we lift our eyes to see what humans can be. We examine our great religious inheritance and find liberation, peace, and human dignity. It's a sacred time, but there's nothing sacred in Washington. On her watch, Pam Bondi oversaw the destruction of, honestly, one of the greatest forces of good America ever created. The Justice Department was formed, after all, to handle the litigation that arose from the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. President Grant, yes, President Ulysses S. Grant, he was there when the department was formed, and he ordered the initial mandate for the mission was to counter and subdue groups in the South that used violence to keep the newly enfranchised, formerly enslaved Americans from voting. Now, it's a human institution. It's not a perfect institution, but in its 100 years, it's done a lot of good. It's protected civil rights, it's protected constitutional freedoms, and it has firmly stood for the rule of law. And in 1 year, Pam Bondi turned that department into a political weapon designed to protect Donald Trump and to punish his adversaries. On her watch, in her hands, the Justice Department has shunned the rule of law, failed to deliver the Epstein documents, treated Congress and the judiciary with contempt, and refused to investigate the murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. But that's not why she was fired. In America, the rule of law still held. Grand juries wouldn't indict sitting congressmen for telling the truth. Judges wouldn't roll over just because the executive branch told them so. So Donald Trump fired her, and he'll find somebody else who will work harder to undermine all this good. My gosh, we lift up our eyes this week, and far away, we see a capsule flying to the moon. That's something we haven't seen in generations. It's inspiring. And you got to have talented people up there doing that. It's dangerous work. The crew, the 4 human beings on that capsule, one is black, one is a woman, 2 are white, and one of those white men is Canadian. My gosh, that's what excellence looks like. Maybe Hegseth and Trump can learn something, but even in this week, I doubt that miracle is possible. But I don't lose faith because around me, all over, I see Americans who want nothing more to do with these people. No, Donald Trump may not be finished with us, but we are finished with him. Finished. And someday we will restore the good that these terrible people have ripped away. All right, I have a great show for you. Jim Santelle is coming up right after the break. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody. Jim Santelle, who's joining me now, worked in the Justice Department when it was a place that honored the rule of law and thought about justice. He served as U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Wisconsin when Obama was president. He still lives in that great state and hosts a podcast, Amicus, a law review, and he continues to practice law. Jim, welcome.
Edwin, it is such a great honor and pleasure to be with you once again. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and looking forward to our discussion to solve all the problems of our nation, right?
Oh, well, we have just about a half, 45 minutes, maybe. We're not going to get anywhere near that. But why don't we start with, your friends over at the Supreme Court? So it seems like a good place to start. There's been a lot going on there. I even listened to the birthright citizenship case. Let's talk about that.
Sure, absolutely. And so perhaps not a complete surprise, but it appears, as the headlines have read recently, that the Supreme Court is once again going to disappoint our president and probably tell him that he is wrong in interpreting the 14th Amendment as he has been interpreting it at least since January 20th of last year. A very interesting engagement, 2 hours. And when people like Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch and even the Chief Justice John Roberts are not buying what you're saying, that as the Solicitor General, his name is John Sauer, Edwin, as you and your listeners know well, when they are pushing back on him and saying that both historically and legally and constitutionally, your argument makes no sense, practically as well, you know that you're in trouble. And maybe the best barometer of that was and remains that while, again, stunningly, we have almost unprecedented, sitting president in the room there when the Supreme Court is arguing and hearing argument about this, he gets up and he leaves, as we well know. That is a sign that things are not going well. And again, the big takeaway from this otherwise very fascinating 2-hour oral argument before the Supreme Court was it appears that a majority of the Supreme Court is going to tell Donald Trump that, nope, if you are born here in America, you are a citizen. That's been the law for well over 100 years. Precedent says that. The law says that. And deal him another blow, as it did with the tariffs matter as well. That's big news. That is big news, not only because of the way the Supreme Court is approaching this, but because maybe, just maybe, the Supreme Court is beginning to recognize that just saying yes to everything the president wants is not a good way to proceed.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. I learned a lot from listening to this. The amendment doesn't. The word domicile does not appear in the in the amendment to the Constitution, right? But they spent the whole time arguing over what that meant. And, it was a sort of fascinating legal trivia and legal arguments. But you're right, almost nobody was buying it. Although I bet you Justice Alito is going to buy it. I don't think it's going to be unanimous, which is kind of shocking.
Right. Yeah, it is shocking, especially since, we've got this case from the Supreme Court in the late 19th century that is very unequivocal about this. The word domicile takes a huge stage during the course of this 2-hour argument, and one might think that's what this is going to turn on in the end, not to be silly about this, but I almost think that people like Amy Coney Barrett and even the Chief Justice, when he looks at the Solicitor General and says, yes, the Constitution is still real. Some of the facts of this and the history of this may be old. They're almost playing with him. They're just trying to explore whether or not there is anything there. for your listeners, for you, for me, for everyone else. Again, an interesting law school examination here, but in the end, probably a fairly clear statement about what the 14th Amendment means. And to go get a little wonky on that, just this notion that the language in the 14th Amendment says subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. That subject to the jurisdiction language does not, in fact, carve out an exception to the citizenship that goes along with somebody who's born here in America. And again, a lot of discussion also about a thing called birth tourism. And again, the Chief Justice says, yeah, we appreciate that, Mr. Solicitor General. You would recognize that particular events or a series of events as it happens around the world, not at all relevant to the issue that we've got to decide. And yet John Sauer thinks this is the key to all of this, and the Supreme Court Chief Justice shuts him down. Telling, very telling.
I was happy what I heard, but I remember, and I just want to raise this with you, that the very last time, and it was only, a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, that the court looked at the 14th Amendment. It was to tell Colorado that notwithstanding that they found that Donald Trump had sworn an oath to protect the Constitution, he had incited an insurrection and wasn't, by the very same amendment, a different part of it, but by the same amendment, not eligible to be president of the United States. And the court sort of shockingly said, no, Congress has to actually enact laws about that.
Right. Again, it was hopefully not. We don't have to invoke that too often, but I think that's exactly the right word, Edwin. It was a shocking result, even in sort of its peculiarity. All right, so now we've got to have the Congress to make those findings. That, as you said, courts, legitimate courts, the Supreme Court in Colorado had made that finding. It came in the wake of trials and evidence and witnesses and documents and presentations there. And the Supreme Court says no, only the legislature can do that. Again, not without the strong dissenting voices of some members of the Supreme Court. Right. But to your other question, where does that come from, right? And maybe we haven't had to address hugely the invocation of who can and cannot run for office. Thankfully, because insurrections are not that frequent, but we had one, or at least an attempted insurrection. Again, a very peculiar result by the Supreme Court. And again, maybe, just maybe in the wake of that, certainly the July 4th of 2024 decision granting any president immunities for certain crimes committed in office, maybe, just maybe, John Roberts and maybe Amy Coney Barrett, maybe to some extent, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh are beginning to think that maybe this is too much, and we need to at least reassert some sense of constitutional rightness.
Sure. They're getting ready to clamp down on the next president who won't be a Republican. But we'll see. Right. We'll see. Right. And you know what? I'm all for the rule of law no matter who's in the White House. And a president who can do anything he wants is a bad president no matter what party they come from.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. You just don't, you want to have checks and balances to say the things, again, that all of us, including your listeners, know about. That's basic civics. You want these things to apply across the board. You know, the Supreme Court, as you and I have chatted before, also invokes this major questions doctrine when it wants to. It basically shuts down Joe Biden when he wants to ensure that we're all safe and secure in the midst of the COVID epidemic by having businesses of more than 100 certify that their employees have either been vaccinated or they're otherwise monitoring that. And the Supreme Court says, no, that's too big, that's too new, you can't do it. Environmental things, the same sorts of things. But when you've got Donald Trump issuing all these executive orders, suddenly, although it surfaced again recently in another case involving tariffs, that's the one time they sort of invoked it, you do have this Supreme Court giving this president an awful lot of latitude that they have not afforded previous presidents.
Well, Jim, raising the major questions doctrine is going to get me to a place I didn't want to go, but I'm here. So let's. The biggest, one of the biggest jobs of the Supreme Court in a complicated country like ours is to make sure that across the enterprise of law in America, we know what the law is.
Yes.
so that judges can, right, so that across the country, people can be treated fairly, so that
Yeah.
judges know what the law is, that lawyers know what the law is. This the simple tariffs case where they
Mhm.
decided, yeah, you know what? Of course, the president doesn't get to tax everybody. That belongs to
Right.
Congress. It should have been a very
Right.
quick decision, but it wasn't because they spent so much time trying to explain to America what this brand new doctrine of theirs, the major questions doctrine, is. And it's clear they don't agree with themselves. They have made a
Right.
complete hash of what we don't know what the law is anymore. And that is, if you are an institutionalist, if you are John Roberts and you look in the mirror and you go, oh, great, all my life I wanted to get rid of the Voting Rights Act and maybe I'll do that. But I also
Mhm.
made it so that Americans don't know what the law is, so that judges are complaining that they can't figure out what they're supposed to do because we used the shadow docket and didn't explain anything. And now
Right.
we have this new doctrine that we don't even understand. I think that is disgraceful.
It is. It is. And I agree with you enthusiastically, Edwin. And for the two reasons, the two buckets of things you just described. One is, and you're making direct allusion to it, and you're spot on, of course. This is not just people like you and me and your listeners and others and lawyers out there, but it is judges, federal judges, who are obviously looking to the Supreme Court to tell those judges, especially federal district court judges, trial judges, what the law is. And as you've indicated, when it comes to this shadow docket, not only is the Supreme Court issuing these one-sentence orders on major issues, not only about what the president can do in terms of hiring and firing people, but about programs, the sizes of agencies, access to their information, all kinds of things, grants for the National Institutes of Health, all kinds of things. Doing that, as we have chatted before, with one or maybe one sentence, maybe one paragraph, and then when federal district court judges in another matter that's arguably tangentially related do not follow that particular shadow docket, non-final decision, they get criticized by members of the Supreme Court itself. That you've got federal judges who are throwing their hands up and saying, what is going on here? And then the larger point is the one that you made as well. In companion with that, not everybody needs to be spending every waking moment. We've got families to raise. We've got work to do. We've got other things to enjoy about America. But when Americans themselves don't know what the law is, and you made reference to it, even something as simple as the threat now that maybe next time you and I chat, we're going to be talking about the final demise of the Voting Rights Act. Well, even the threat to that, it provides a certain amount of uncertainty among the population. How do you draw lines then for congressional elections that are coming up? How do you make decisions about how voting is to happen when you're uncertain about what the highest court in the land has articulated in terms of its opinions? And then in this, again, I can't overstate it, as you and I would not overstate it, but just the lack of precision. It's a mess. And it's also, as you just indicated, a scandal, which with all Americans should be wildly, wildly disappointed, dismayed, and condemning the Supreme Court for not being that voice of clarity, which it should be. It should have been for the past 238 years.
We need it to be. We really need it to be.
We
Let me
do.
ask
We
you about a
absolutely
different
do.
question. I'm not sure I blame the Supreme Court for this one, but this very complicated question of free speech in America. And it doesn't seem complicated, but here I'm going to ask you about two different rulings. One is, I
Yeah.
think, one is not a Supreme Court ruling, but the conversion therapy
Yeah.
ruling this week that said, look, you cannot stop doctors from engaging in conversion therapy. It is, after all, their First Amendment right to talk about it. It's a talking therapy. They can say whatever they want in therapy. And the second ruling is the ruling against Meta and Google that in some
Yeah.
ways takes free speech in a different direction. So I'd like you to talk about both of them and help us understand, like, where, most of my life, I thought I understood free speech and it wasn't complicated. And now I'm confused.
I think the confusion is well placed, Edwin, because a lot of this is irreconcilable. On conversion therapy, right, also comes out of Colorado. They produce a lot of cases, as you well know, coming to the Supreme Court. And just as an aside, I can't pass up this opportunity on your wonderful discussion, your wonderful show, just to affirm once again for all your listeners that not only the great majority, but maybe not 100%, but 99.9% of all medical authorities recognize that this kind of, don't even call it therapy, whatever it is, whatever the treatment is, not only is it ineffective in trying to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, but it's affirmatively destructive. And again, the problem with the conversion therapy decision, which was to say, Colorado, you got it just right, you cannot inhibit a therapist from talking with their parents, with her patients. That's how she describes this. And therefore, the law that you have passed that bans conversion therapy is discredited. It plainly will have implications far beyond Colorado, including right where I am here in Wisconsin, Illinois, other places. 20-some other states have similar bans. Those will likely now be subject to challenge down the road. But again, to your fundamental point, this is not a First Amendment free speech case. Nobody was maintaining, Neil Gorsuch, who wrote the majority opinion here. Nobody was maintaining that therapists can't talk to their patients. What you can't do is engage in this very concerted, very directive medical approach that has as its aim to change who you are, frankly, with very dramatic mechanisms. That's what this was about. And it used to be in the worlds that we were used to here, Edwin, that the question would be, is there a logical nexus? Is what the legislature, the Congress has done, is there some reasonable relationship to what its assignment is to keep us safe and secure and what they're doing? Here, how much more clear could it be? You've got all these states, all these legislatures saying a bad medical procedure, we would not permit this in any other circumstance, or we should not permit it if there are doctors out there doing other things that are harming people. So the legislatures come forward and say, this is something proven to be harmful, and we are prohibiting it. A direct connection between what we want to do to preserve the safety and security of our population and what we are doing, which is banning it. And yet we pollute this with a First Amendment argument. They seize upon what the therapist said and get it wrong in the end. And now this tail is going to wag the dog here going forward. As to then you've got out in California, Los Angeles, the Superior Court there. You've got Meta and the other platforms there. You've got a jury there, right?
Yep.
And likewise, playing with First Amendment speech issues that are confounding, undeniably.
Yeah, it's a very, I mean, I know the world is complicated. Technology has moved faster than the law and made, and put us in some interesting places. But I mean, free speech is so profoundly important to us.
Right.
That it'd be nice if we all understood what it was in the same, in close to the same way, but I guess we won't for a while. And by the way,
Right.
I fully agree with you about conversion therapy. And just side note, this is an administration who, out of the unrelated to the law, but in its certain approach to public health through RFK Jr., is full of, oh, well, quack remedies are great and real remedies may not be. I mean, the outbreaks of measles are the tip of the spear of public health outbreaks because it's more contagious than things like polio. But all these terrible diseases are coming back because of these terrible people. And so, of course, they're going to go to court to try and protect terrible therapies.
Right. And it's a reflection of this other thing that you and I have chatted about previously, and I know that many of your listeners embrace also. It's the broader sense that we no longer trust the people who know things, who know what they're talking about, right? Many things I know nothing about: science, medicine, engineering, all kinds of things. I can go on. But I trust the people, especially in the medical community, speaking about Health and Human Services. Yes, the old CDC, if you will, right, and other National Institutes of Health, populated by people who have gone to medical school, who are experienced, and are, again, doing their very best, maybe not getting it right initially all the time, but wrestling mightily with it. And in the end, doing the right thing, we no longer trust them in America. And this kind of derision that has now been sanctioned by many, many portions of our government, including some courts out there that say, well, yes, that's the scientist. That's the expert, Mr. Santelle. But my gut tells me that that's wrong. And that is a very dangerous thing for the life and quite literally the lives of Americans. Here in Wisconsin, we've got outbreaks, too, of measles. They're in Milwaukee. They're upstate Wisconsin. They're in the county that I live in. And I asked my sister, who's a medical doctor, are my immunities, are they still in place? And why is that happening in 2026? Is because we don't trust the people who know what they're talking about. We have lived a much better life in the 20th century, 21st century because of medicine. And apparently in many sectors, we don't want to do that anymore. Now being embraced by government and by some courts, including the Supreme Court, again, getting rid of this notion of reliance upon agency officials and agency experts. It is very troubling. And in that area, like others, people may die as a result of it. The stakes could not be higher.
Yep. Jim, I agree with you. I want to say it differently because I don't think the problem is that we don't trust experts. I think the problem is that Donald Trump is the president and he has decided that he's going to play on our skepticism and do terrible things. Because you know what, we didn't trust or distrust science anymore 3 years ago, and yet we weren't here. The difference is that he's president. Yeah.
He's president,
All right.
And he sanctions that, right? If you are now out there doubting what your medical doctor says or anyone else in a position of responsibility and expertise, Donald Trump, like so many other things that he does, he gives you permission to do that. I agree with you entirely.
He wants you to. He wants to be the only source of truth in the world.
Yeah.
All right, let's turn from the courts to a place you're very familiar with, the Justice Department. And Pam Bondi. We were talking, as we talked about the courts, about what the law is, but in Pam Bondi's hands, we have to talk about like who the law applies to, because her view is it applies to thee, but not to me.
Right, exactly. And when it comes to redefining, I'm so glad you identified that issue, Edwin. When it comes to defining how we apply, I mean, we can have differences in interpretation. That's why we've got trials. That's why we've got appellate courts. And that's why we've got even Supreme Court arguments of this past week. We can disagree, and ultimately some judge or judges are going to tell us what the law is, but it's that application of the law. And I begin, I think, at the core of this. She's issued memorandums, and we'll see if Todd Blanche, now the acting Attorney General, changes this. He probably won't. The core of the problem with the Department of Justice has been this radical change about who they serve. Throughout the entire 30-year period of time that I was U.S. Attorney, and obviously most of that before that, an Assistant U.S. Attorney, the mission, the purpose, the oath of office was clear. Mr. Santelle, you have a commission on behalf of the people of the United States of America, the Constitution. The president, whether it's Barack Obama or Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan or George Bush or Donald Trump, is not your client. And in the last 14 months, obviously, that has changed. Pam Bondi is the architect of that, and she has completely broken down the wall that you and I have talked about before, in place clearly in the wake of Watergate, to ensure that the president is not directing what the Department of Justice does. Pam Bondi comes along and she says, nope, our client is now a fellow named Donald John Trump. He lives in the big White House with those pillars over there, and we serve him. And everything else from my perspective, again, many other aspects of Pam Bondi that are hugely problematic, but it all derives from that. Who are you working for? Who is your boss, if you will? And if it's no longer maybe in a broad sense, the Department of Justice, but really the people of this country, everything else that she has done, including pursuing the president's campaign of retribution, trying unsuccessfully to get prosecutions of people who are his political foes. All of that, this mess, this disaster with the Epstein files, which we can talk about that for 3 or 4 hours, of course, all of that, to my mind, derives from a completely different Department of Justice. And Edwin, I will tell you this out loud for all of your listeners as well. I do not recognize this Department of Justice anymore. I don't know. Again, it's easy for me to say I'm no longer there. I don't know how people who are showing up to work every day, I'm talking assistant U.S. attorneys in the Northern District of Illinois and Eastern Wisconsin and lawyers and Maine Justice around the country, how you wake up in the morning and go in and do your work. You can do it in the specific cases that you're trying, but the commission of the very agency for which you're working is no longer what the Constitution contemplates. And we've seen, again, 2 responses to that, right? You've got the people who have said, I can't do this anymore, whether it's in Minneapolis, whether it's the Civil Rights Division, and they simply say, I am leaving because my ethics are more important, or they get fired. They get fired. And that, again, a reflection of how dramatic this change has taken place inside the department, completely reversing its role, its purpose for the past 14 months. Every indication that Todd Blanche, again, now our acting attorney general, who not too long ago heralded the fact that in the FBI, we've now fired anybody who had anything to do with Donald Trump's prosecutions. That's a great thing. Every indication that will continue, and that the departure of good and, once again, experienced people who know what they're doing from the department will continue. Again, this is unrecognizable to me.
The Department of Justice kept us safer. It did a lot of things. I mean, it preserved rights. It had a civil rights division that they have now turned upside down. I can't. It's so disappointing. I can't even talk about it. But like the cases that you had when you were a U.S. attorney, there are a lot of crimes that require investigation and preparation for trial that take a lot of time and keep us safer. Complicated crimes, big cases of fraud, big cases of big criminal drug cases. Everybody who worked on those cases has been pulled off of them and told to go deal with the overflow of habeas complaints because the government is just pulling people off the street without any due process. So the things that you worked, I mean, talk about some of the things you worked on to keep Americans safer when you were at the Justice Department that aren't getting done now.
Absolutely. And you listed many of them. Let's start at the Civil Rights Division, basically decimated, again, at the hands of, again, a presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed Assistant Attorney General. She's brought in from California. She's also, for what it's worth, one of these people who thinks that Donald Trump did, in fact, win the election, all right, in 2020. But putting all that to one side, huge departures. And what does the Civil Rights Division do? It's not just the things that are in the headlines. Housing cases, employment discrimination cases, right? Cases involving government monies being given to companies that are obliged to follow the law when it comes to hiring and promotion. Huge numbers of things. Policing, oversight of that, the special litigation section, all but gone. The Department of Justice shutting down all those major oversight actions in cities around the country to ensure that your local police are doing things well and doing things according to the way the Constitution, that is all gone. I can go on about the Civil Rights Division and the things it is no longer doing, in part, once again, because of departures of the people who did that routinely. And again, Edwin, cannot overstate what you just said. We're taking these very, very sophisticated people and having them either do reviews of Epstein files or, as you said, in the most overcrowded district now in the nation dealing with all these habeas corpus petitions, most of which probably need to be granted because we didn't think about that. That's the Civil Rights Division. But again, other things are not being attended to. When is the last time you heard about a major environmental case? And they're still out there around the edges, and some of them are being settled. But a major environmental case, whether it's in Chicago or Milwaukee or other places, that really addresses and needs to address a major problem, polluting our air, our water, our environment. What about, again, just the basic criminal cases that you talked about? We again, think a lot about the violent crime, and that certainly is at the top of the list. But we also have human trafficking, sex trafficking. You would think that with all of the focus upon the Epstein files these days, that someone would look around and say, well, wait a minute, what is the Department of Justice doing now to address international problems of that sort? And yes, every so often there is a case that percolates up. But that, again, the focus on the impact of crime upon human beings cannot be overstated. Problems involving international contraband and things being brought into our nation that, again, were part and parcel of what the government did. Now this administration, in the interest of complete commercial freedom, if you will, a word I would really not describe as being what's going on here, says, no, we're not going to do those kinds of cases. You know, all these kinds of things, even tax cases, corporate cases, the easy approvals of these mergers that, again, would otherwise be subject inside the antitrust division, another part of the Department of Justice not being attended to. I can go on. And I think, Edwin, to your good question, I remember as an assistant U.S. attorney, not every one of those falls in that category of a magnanimous, huge a magnitude that's so huge in Milwaukee or other places. But many of them, some of them do. And when I think about the fact that that's no longer on the docket of this Department of Justice, I wonder about the short-term and then the long-term impact of not doing these cases, again, that make our communities better, even in the side of civil and criminal litigation.
Right. So that I wanted you to do that, and thank you for doing that. So I want people to understand that it isn't the affirmatively terrible things. It isn't only the affirmatively terrible things this administration is doing. It is, we are so accustomed over the years to just, not talking about the good our government does, that it's hard to know what we have lost. We have lost. And we've lost some incredible things. So today, instead of making sure that companies can hire the best employees out there, if you hire a black employee, you have to be prepared for the Justice Department to sue you to make you prove that you didn't discriminate against a white person when you hired a black person, right? This is the world we're in with this Justice Department. And let's talk about one other thing about them. I want to talk to you specifically about the payout of to Mike Flynn, and then the January 6ers suing to be paid, and of course Donald Trump suing to be paid. So Mike Flynn was convicted, right, of lying to the FBI. This is Donald Trump's first national security advisor, former General Mike Flynn. Then he said, "Oh, well, I want to recant my conviction," but that was thrown out of court, and he was suing. And his suit for, like, you prosecuted me wrong was tossed out of court, but he had appealed it. And then the Justice Department miraculously settled it and handed him a bag of cash.
Right. It is stunning, and this is the other part of what the Department of Justice is doing. For in this instance, the other one that comes to mind, even as you described the Mike Flynn outrage, is the other thing they're doing in, again, many of these voting cases, other things involving policies in states that they do not like. The Department of Justice will end up suing an attorney general, say, for example, in Texas, Florida, who is plainly friendly to them. They filed a lawsuit challenging a state policy by the legislature, and the state, the attorney general, turns around, settles it, and says, yes, that is wrong. We're going to rescind that, and that too is a misuse of the system. As to Mike Flynn, I shake my head and scratch my head in abject disbelief, and it goes back to this notion, Edwin, that I think is afoot now in the Department of Justice. We can do it not because it's anywhere near right, not because there's historical precedent reason for it, not because there's something justice related to it, but just because we can. And we want to rewrite history. Michael Flynn is a great example of that. Look down the road. People are writing their theses about this in 20 years or so. Will say, well, in the end, the Department of Justice apparently acknowledged that the prosecutions of him were unfounded, and he got money for it. It was compensated. We are planning and we are rewriting history. The big one, of course, which is the first thing you mentioned, the January 6th insurrectionists. Not only the pardons, but again, the resurrection of their legitimacy. I suspect that many of them are in Chicago, other places as ICE agents now, which is another horrific way of dealing with law enforcement. But we have turned or attempting to turn all of that around. And that's why I applaud you and others who continue to say, no. January 6th was an attempt to overthrow the government and to overthrow what our basic approaches to elections and voting are. Let us never forget that, and that there was violence. This was not, as one of my senior senator has said, this was not a calm event. This was not tourists. These were people who were trying to overthrow the government. This administration plainly trying to rewrite that very story as well. And again,
put their hands in your pocket and mine to pay them off, to say, right. Oh, great, we can a suit and pay you for having tried to tear down the United States government. I'm so mad about that. Oh, I'm so mad about that. And Donald himself suing the government for $10 billion.
Yes, yeah. Wow. We'll get rid of all the people who have investigated you, who have prosecuted you. Again, grand juries who returned indictments against you, judges who sentenced you based upon the fact that there was a basis for doing so, upholding your criminal judgments. And now all of that, the message is all of that was fraud. All of that was wrong. This is a huge conspiracy. And now we are compensating you for the horrific thing that a prior administration, the government, did to you. We are so sorry. Please accept our apology. What a stunning, stunning thing to happen in the United States of America.
Yeah, I'm hoping Jack Smith, the next attorney general, but
Oh, absolutely, right? And
a little integrity would be nice, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about someone brought in, again, doing everything right. There's a man of huge ethics. His appearances even on Capitol Hill, whether public or not, I know exactly how he behaved, which was with integrity and clarity, and telling us again that had those cases gone to trial, Mar-a-Lago documents and the insurrection case, and Donald Trump not been reelected president, right now, by this time, those cases would be either in trial or through trial. And the person named Donald John Trump would have not only a New York State conviction, but also almost certainly 2 federal convictions in our federal courts in Florida and then in Washington, D.C.
Yes, he'd be living in federal housing he couldn't tear down.
Right, exactly.
Speaking of tearing down the White House, I want to stop for a minute because we've talked about some of the odd stuff from the Supreme Court and what's the horror show that's happened to the Justice Department. But the rule of law is holding courtesy of some remarkable work in lower courts. Remarkable work. And the case of you're done trying to destroy the White House until you get the kinds of approvals you have to get. It came from a Reagan appointed, I can't remember, a Reagan or George H.W. Bush appointed judge. But talk about some of the things the lower courts have done that keep you confident.
Right. There are reasons for being confident about the future, and your listeners should know them as well. I do think, as an aside, grand juries, as you know well, Edwin, are also stepping up and saying, no, we're not doing what the government wants us to do when it comes to indicting these. Right?
Amazing.
They're out there.
Like who in America even knew they existed? And yet,
right. When I teach and have to explain now who these people are, where do they come from? We always talk about grand jury indictments. Now we need to know they're doing that. They're saying no to U.S. attorneys when it comes to prosecuting the people who are Donald Trump's adversaries. And your other point is the big one. At the top of the list, the bastions, the safeguards for democracy, federal district court judges. You can identify many of them. There's Mame Frimpong in Los Angeles who said, no, before you arrest people, you got to have reasonable suspicion, reasonable basis to do so. The Supreme Court stunningly overturns her, but her voice is important. Let's talk about James Boasberg, who is who used to be the chief judge in D.C., and he is the one who, again, I date the constitutional crisis in America, which we're now suffering under, from March 15th, the date that the government first began to lie to and to assemble with a federal judge telling him no or telling him we're not going to do this. James Boasberg, again, having hearings about the contemptuous behavior of the Department of Justice. Paula Zinnes in Maryland, another federal district court judge, again, with respect to Kilmar Abrego Garcia, saying no to the government. You cannot do these kinds of things. Obviously, right here in Chicago, that the judges who reviewed not only the National Guard being brought in, but also the work of ICE folks, and saying, no, I'm going to monitor this. I'm going to prevent you from doing the kinds of things that are not consistent with the way that we behave on the streets of Chicago and Portland and Los Angeles, other places. The list goes on and on and on. So many federal district court judges, almost with pure unanimity, are saying no. And they're not saying no because they don't like the president. That's not this. When you read their opinions, they're talking about the precedents that were issued by the Supreme Court, by judges on both sides of the political aisle, wherever they came from whatever president, and saying this is inconsistent with the way that we arrest people and the way that we detain people. This is not consistent with the way that we deal with people who plainly maybe should not be here, but we give them due process before we load them on planes and send them off to El Salvador or to other countries that are not their places of origin. And they're saying you cannot do that without due process. They're not saying in the end you can't do it ultimately. You can't just do it by a raw exercise of power. So many examples related to funding, obviously cases involving academic funding. We've seen that so many times. Federal district court judges, even the arts, saying, no, you can't do this. And again, federal district court judges, top of the list, grand jurors, those prosecutors are refusing to do these things. And the fourth one that I'll add to the list of safeguards is people. And I know that is maybe trite to say. The protests are important and meaningful, right? And people should know that they have an impact, and they're also a safeguard against the loss of democracy.
Well, the people are going to get say very soon on a Wisconsin Supreme Court race yet again.
Yes.
And tell us a little bit about how that's going.
Sure. So once again, we have, not getting nearly the amount of attention that it has in the past, mostly because this one will not change the ideological makeup of the Supreme Court, but we've got an appellate court.
And because Elon Musk is afraid to come to your state now.
Exactly. After having spent an awful lot of money and being told by Wisconsinites that, well, that's very interesting, we're not going to buy into that quite literally. But we've got Judge Taylor, who is a trial court judge, very, very expert in doing what she's done, very normal, decent, saying the right things. Maria Lazar, who is a state appeals court judge, and those two are running. Plainly, we once again have a conservative in Lazar and the so-called liberal in Taylor. I don't especially like those titles just because they tend to
don't anymore. They don't fit. They don't fit the era we're in.
Exactly. And so I recoil even when I see the candidates themselves kind of using those terms or their campaigns doing it. You want to look at the kind of person that they are. And yes, you want to look at the judges, the decisions that they made, and you want to listen hard to their debates, which we've had in Wisconsin, and again, showing a very different view about how you approach the law as an appeals court judge, as a trial court judge, as a Supreme Court justice. That's what's all important. I don't care if you're appointed by a Republican or a Democrat governor or a Republican or Democratic president. Show me what you've done. I want to read your opinions. There is a very big difference between these two. And the only concern I have about my state right now is that the latest polling, as you probably know, from Marquette University, which does some pretty good polling, is an awful lot of people, again, this hasn't gotten a lot of attention, are not attentive to this race and barely know who the candidates are. We're days away. And that is a concern, that the population has not been animated, again, in part because because whatever happens here is not going to change the balance inside the Supreme Court, but could down the road. And every single justice who is there has a vote out of the 7, and on major commercial issues, and yes, on religious issues, and on balance of powers issues, and environmental issues, and antitrust issues, all those kinds of things. A 7-member Supreme Court has a huge impact. Yeah. Right, huge impact, and we cannot forget that.
All right, well, Jim, we've run out of time.
You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody, welcome back. Brian Finucane is a senior advisor with the U.S. program at the International Crisis Group, an editor with Just Security in another era. He served us as an attorney and advisor in the U.S. State Department. Brian, thank you and welcome.
Good to join you.
So, I'm going to call it a war. This war in the Middle East is going south rapidly. But Donald Trump went on TV and he took, he gave this national address. He told us they had no air defenses. And since then, 2 planes have been shot down. We have a pilot missing somewhere in Iran. He's just lying to us about this war. And you've written that he isn't just lying to us, he's waging it illegally. And I want to talk about this war, and I want to talk about Venezuela. One seems more of a violation of U.S. law, the other more a violation of international law. Both of them seem out of place, and I'd love you to help us understand the context.
Sure. So this is a war, and the administration refers to it as such when they can't catch themselves and try to remember their talking points. And the president himself has repeatedly referred to it as a war. So your listeners may recall that under the U.S. Constitution, Article 1 gives to Congress the power to declare a war and related authorities over the use of military force. Article 2 makes the president the commander-in-chief. Now, the framers of the Constitution understood that as commander-in-chief, the president would have some limited authority to use force unilaterally, and that was to repel sudden attack, right? And that was confirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court during the Civil War and the prize cases. But what is taking place here with respect to both Venezuela and particularly with respect to Iran is that President Trump has used military force without prior authorization from Congress. That is, he did not receive a declaration of war from Congress or an authorization for the use of military force with respect to military action against either country. And there's a very important link between the two in that President Trump launched this war of choice against Iran because of the tactical success of his intervention in Venezuela in January. He was riding a sugar high, and he wanted to reproduce that. He wanted another quick win, another military spectacle, another decapitation strike, and to replace the leader of Iran, like, as he did in Venezuela, with someone more pliable. And he's referred repeatedly to trying to replicate the Venezuela model in Iran.
It's so shocking to me. I mean, when you think about the contempt of Congress that he's shown, I mean, presidents have taken us to war with minimal congressional support. I mean, I think Jefferson didn't have Congress's support for the war against the Barbary pirates, right? I mean, we've done this a lot, but mostly we've stuck to the script. The guys who founded the country, because of their experience with the king, they knew that letting one man tax everybody for the cost of a huge war and send their kids to die in a huge war without asking them, is it okay, is a tyranny, is an absolute path to tyranny. And that's what this guy's done. I mean, it's costing us $1.5 billion a day. And people now, 13 are dead. Hundreds Americans are injured. And in our name, he's promising war crimes. These are war crimes he's promising, aren't they?
If some of the bluster that he has issued on social media is actually implemented, yes, they would amount to war crimes. The threat to attack all of Iran's power plants, that would amount to a war crime. I can get into why in a moment, but I think it is worth unpacking something you just said. Yes, very much so. The framers of the Constitution gave the power to declare war to Congress in order to prevent one man from taking the country to war on a whim. The war was intended to require public debate and deliberation by the people's elected representatives, because it was one of the most consequential decisions a nation could make, whether to expend this blood and treasure. And that was a deliberate departure from the English system, in which the king could declare war. Okay.
Right.
And so this has completely turned the constitutional scheme on its head. Now, even Jefferson, drew a distinction between offensive and defensive operations
Mhm.
against the Barbary pirates. Really, the only comparable military operation to what we're seeing now in against Iran, in terms of unilateralism by the executive, is the Korean War, the Korean police action, when President Truman entered that war without prior congressional authorization. That was really the high watermark for presidential unilateralism and the use of military force.
Mhm. And it was a general, General Eisenhower, who took 5 minutes to say, nuts, this is crazy, and end it when he had the chance.
Right. I mean, Eisenhower took a lot of lessons away from Truman's experience in Korea, including the need for congressional support, congressional buy-in prior to committing U.S.
Mhm.
Forces in any sort of operation of that scale.
Yeah. So um, that's the American law, right? You've talked about the American law, but we've also signed treaties and we're part of a whole set of international understandings about war. There's a kind of a letter that we agree to send to the UN when we talk about this. It has some number. I can't remember what it is. Could you talk a little bit about what we by treaty, not by it's a treaty that we agreed to, after all, what our obligations are to international law and what we're doing?
Absolutely. So the legal framework under international law that governs use of force is laid out in the UN Charter. Now, that's a treaty that the U.S. played a critical role in establishing after the Second World War. And the cornerstone, really, of the UN Charter and international law in general is Article 2.4 of that treaty, which prohibits the threat or use of force by states in their international relations. Okay. Now, that prohibition grew out of the bitter experience of two world wars and the horrors of the Holocaust, right? And the U.S. played an absolutely vital role in establishing it. Now, that prohibition on the use of force is subject to narrow exceptions. One of them is self-defense, individual or collective self-defense, which is preserved in Article 51 of the treaty. Okay, and that's the letter that you mentioned a moment
Right,
ago.
Article 51. That's right.
Yep, the
That's
so-called Article 51 letter. So when the U.S. or any other country uses force purportedly in self-defense, that has to be reported to the U.S. Security Council through letter under Article 51. Now, a key point that I want to emphasize is that not only was the U.S. absolutely critical in establishing the UN Charter and the prohibition of the use of force, but this treaty is not just binding on the U.S. as a matter of international law, it is binding on the U.S. as a matter of domestic law. Okay, under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, treaties are the law of the land. And under the Take Care Clause of Article 2 of the Constitution, the president individually has a constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And for these purposes,
I got to interrupt you there. He does not. The Take Care Clause he's paid no attention to that on so many different areas of law. I would be shocked if this would be the one area where he would actually pay attention to it.
no, I agree with you, but I think it is important to recall and remind ourselves of what the laws are, okay, not succumb to legal nihilism in this
Right.
space.
That's right.
Because that this is sort of the Tinkerbell fairy test for the laws, right? If we stop believing in it, it dies, right? And so for the purpose.
Being bonding. Yeah.
Yes, and so if we succumb to that sort of nihilism, then it's self-fulfilling. Then of course the laws won't matter anymore because no one will believe in them.
But he does have that obligation. Yep.
Absolutely. So just as he has the obligation to take care of the U.S. Constitution and federal statutes are faithfully executed, he has an obligation to see that treaties are faithfully executed. And I really want to emphasize this point because that's regardless of whether the courts could ever enforce them. Because there's a whole, as we're discovering now, there's a whole raft of laws from the Constitution, federal statutes, and treaties which are the courts are almost never going to weigh in on, right, for a whole variety of reasons.
Mhm.
But the president is still constitutionally obligated to see that they are faithfully executed.
Yeah, the remedy for that is, of course, impeachment. That's the one. That's the remedy for not following when the president is lawless. It's a remedy that we may never be able to use, but that's the one that's in the law. So, did we send a notice, an Article 51 letter about Iran?
Yes, more than a week after the U.S. Intervention began, the U.S. Operation Epic Fury began on the 28th of February, and then more than a week later, the U.S. did submit a letter to the United Nations. It was not particularly persuasive, not persuasive at all, in fact, in terms of the legal justification advanced for the operation. Happy to get into why that is.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what we said. I mean, it's more than we told the American people. So I'd be interested to know what he had to say.
So it was well, first off, it's notable that how late it was. When I was at State Department, I used to help prepare these things, and
Mm.
we'd be working on these, basically in the lead up to military and any sort of military intervention, or in the immediate aftermath, and would typically get them to the Security Council in short order. This arrived, like I say, more than a week later. The letter advances a number of sort of justifications under international law for the U.S. attack on Iran. Claims that the U.S. Is acting in collective self-defense of Israel. It claims that Iran poses an imminent threat to the United States. And it also says that for a number of years that the U.S. and Iran have been in an ongoing armed conflict. Now, one of the real problems here is that in order for self-defense to be lawful, it has to either be your response to a prior armed attack, that you're responding to having previously been attacked, or in response to imminent threat of such an attack. And the letter doesn't really make the case for either of those. Doesn't explain what supposed attack either Israel or the United States suffered prior to this war, or what imminent threat Iran posed either to Israel or the United States.
Right. I mean, Iran has been a bad actor on the world stage. They're not, by the way, the only bad actor on the world stage, but they have been a bad actor. But that isn't a legal cause for war.
That's right. And the letter goes through a litany of misdeeds that it attributes to Iran. Some of them Iran directly, others to groups that Iran supports. So it's absolutely true that Iran has done a lot of things that are terrible both to its own population and to others. But that doesn't necessarily give rise to a right to use military force against it.
Yeah. Um, this question of a right to use force as opposed to you have force, you can use it. This is part of this international rules-based order that has characterized the world for my whole life. And it has, well, Trump and his crowd think it should come crashing down. They don't like it. They think this destruction of that order is long overdue. As the president describes it, this old order was just a way to play Americans for suckers that were better off without it. It was just a way to, get us to pay for everybody else's defense and to cheat us on our trade deals. And so he thinks we're better, even if he doesn't have anything to replace it with yet. He just thinks we're better off without it, sort of like he thought about the ACA. Let's just get rid of it without anything else to replace it with. Why are they wrong?
Well, to go back to something I mentioned a moment ago, the U.S. played a critical role in establishing this international legal order and the international order
Absolutely.
more general, and it does
The critical role. Yeah.
and did so for very good reasons. The framers of the UN Charter were very mindful of the bitter experience again of two world wars and the Holocaust, which killed collectively tens of millions of people, right? And they wanted to establish a system that made a repetition of that much less likely. Okay,
Mhm.
and that is why, albeit imperfectly, the U.S. has served as a vital pillar of that international legal order in the ensuing 8 decades. The U.S. benefits, generally speaking, from some degree of international peace and security. It benefits economically, benefits from having to spend less on national defense itself. And another value, there's a benefit that the U.S. derives from this, and this is something that President Trump himself has talked about repeatedly since the 1980s, is that a world in which there are strong security alliances like NATO, and in which the UN Charter is respected, the prohibition on the use of force is respected, is a world that's less likely to see nuclear proliferation. Okay, because if states are fearful that they are going to be subject to attack, conquest, uh, or invasion, they're much more likely to develop the ultimate atomic insurance policy, and that endangers everybody. And so the U.S. has long had a strong interest in promoting nuclear nonproliferation, undermining NATO, undermining other U.S. defense alliances, and undermining the prohibition of the use of force by attacking countries illegally, like in Iran. That is a recipe for nuclear proliferation.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't going to go there, but I think it's fair to talk about that. So right now there are I forget how many, 14 countries that we know of that have nuclear weapons. It's something like, I don't remember precisely. But there are a lot more that have been talking about it. I mean, in the Middle East, now you have Saudis saying, look, you can't control Iran. We can't count on you to protect us anymore. Look what's happened. We need this weapon. Um, uh, 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 I don't know if India is one of them now. India wants one. Um, I mean, all over, and the science isn't that hard. And there are plenty of bad actors out there who will sell. I mean, when I think of, I'm sorry, I'm being inarticulate. When I think of what the United States did at the fall of the Soviet Union to stop nuclear proliferation, we not only pushed Ukraine into a deal where we said we would protect them if they give up their weapons, a deal we haven't honored. Um, uh, we went and found all the scientists and employed them, here in U.S. schools, so they wouldn't be searching for a paycheck from a rogue government. We really worked very hard to keep the world safe. And it seems that in every measure, we are now opening the spigot to a world where many people are armed with these weapons, and that is a world where some of them will be used.
Yes, it definitely increases the likelihood of use in battle of a nuclear weapon, the more countries that possess it. And I will say in my conversations with U.S. government experts in nonproliferation going back a year, so before this current war, they were already warning of the risks that Poland, Japan, and South Korea would
Right.
seek to develop nuclear weapons because of their concerns about the reliability of U.S. Security guarantees, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so, after this war, the likelihood that Iran now actually pursues a nuclear weapon goes up dramatically, right? I think the general sense is that the U.S. intelligence community view was that Iran had not yet made a decision whether to go for a weapon. They were a nuclear threshold state, but they had not yet made a decision to go for a weapon. Well, now having been attacked twice, okay, in the space of the last year, their decision making and its infrastructure may have changed somewhat.
Because they can look at North Korea and say, why, they got one, so they're not being,
right.
They don't have to go through this.
So they may well be inclined again to acquire the ultimate atomic insurance policy, since being a nuclear threshold state did not serve as a deterrent.
Have you ever seen any intelligence? I mean, the claim that the president has made, the claim that Bibi Netanyahu has made, is that if Iran has a nuclear weapon, they will use it as fast as they possibly can to take Tel Aviv and all its population off the map. I don't want a nuclear armed Iran, but I want to ask you if there's any evidence that if they got one, instead of using it for deterrence, they would use it offensively and as fast as possible.
I mean, we're sort of in the realm of speculation here, but that sort of scenario assumes that whoever is in Tehran in charge of a future potential nuclear arsenal is suicidal, because the immediate response, if to an attack upon either Israel or the United States or any other nuclear armed state, would be retaliation. So that seems somewhat far fetched. Far more likely would be it seems like the scenario in which it would be used as a deterrent. And
like
again,
North Korea.
and again, we had a arrangement in place up to 2018 that put limits and constrained Iran's nuclear program with an aim to preventing them from acquiring a nuclear weapon, and that was the Iran nuclear deal, multilateral deal that hashed out by the Obama administration. And of course, President Trump tore that up.
Well, let's
Uh,
talk about that,
yep.
because when I talk about it with people, the reaction from many is, oh, they were cheating all the time. You don't like, they were just cheating. They would have had a weapon in no time. Is that response um, completely without evidence? Is that like saying Donald Trump won the 2020 election? I mean, is it just made up, or do we know they were cheating?
No, there's no evidence for that. And I think it's really important to emphasize is that as part of that deal, there were inspections. The IAEA was inspecting their sites, monitoring their sites. Okay. Um, Following on from the 12-day war last year, okay, there have been no inspections.
No
Okay.
inspection.
So we do not have the visibility that we had, before the war, while the Iran nuclear deal was in place. And so that's a much riskier place to be in.
How do you imagine in a world where we have a different administration in the future, we can begin to repair the broken trust with our allies? NATO has said, look, we went through this once, you put them back in power a second time. We can't trust American democracy with our future. And so Europe is going to is going to try and make NATO an alliance where they have a much stronger hand vis-a-vis the United States. That may be okay for the United States. It may not. I don't know. But what does a post-Trump world order look like, since we're going to have to rebuild one on the ruins of what you and I grew up with?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there's no time machine to go back before all this and restore the status quo ante. I think part of that, again, I think you're right to point to the U.S. domestic system, because if our political system can generate this multiple times, that gives our partners and allies cause for uncertainty going forward. And so I think domestic accountability has to play a role. I think strengthening America's domestic political and legal institutions has to play a role. Domestically, part of that is going to be, I think, overhauling the 1973 War Powers Resolution, a key piece of legislation which was intended to put guardrails on when the president could use force unilaterally. Relatedly, trying to restore the salience and binding concerning nature of international law, like the UN Charter domestically, ensuring that the U.S. president adheres to these legal limits, both domestic and international, is going to be play a key role, I think. But there's no one silver bullet to restoring the status quo ante, and we're not gonna get there. There's a lot of different steps that can be taken, but I definitely think accountability and strengthening our domestic legal system has to be part of it.
Yeah, and we haven't spoken about this, but the apparatus, the rules, the structures around international trade are going to have to be rethought. This unilateral use of tariffs has been destructive of global relationships, as has the unilateral use of the military.
That's right. I mean, during the Biden administration, there were a variety of framework statutes proposed that would overhaul a range of national security authorities. The War Powers Resolution being one, but also with respect to the invocation of national emergencies, which is providing the predicate for some of these tariffs. Okay, under the law known as IEPA. And so I think that's another area that's ripe for reform. There's a whole range of executive authorities that the current president has misused. Okay, and that these should be reformed under a future administration. That should be a priority for a future administration. We've seen how these executive powers can be misused, and so we need better guardrails.
Where, for people who want to follow this conversation more and understand it better, where do they go? Where do they find the work? I mean, like Just Security is certainly one spot. Where do they find your work? How do people get to know? If they want to explore this deeper, where can they go?
So yeah, I can't recommend the work on just security enough. There's a lot of just brilliant scholarship in there, including from key actors, who used to be in government, who are still very much plugged in government, and sometimes you have sitting lawmakers, right, for Just Curious. So I recommend that first and foremost. I publish on my own commentary there on a pretty frequent basis. I'm also on Blue Sky and provide, running commentary there. I have good friends that work at the website Lawfare who also provide commentary on, national security law, international law, and potential reform. So those are all good outlets to look. And then, in terms of if you're interested in understanding the regions in which the U.S. is operating, I want to understand what's going on in Iran, what's going on in Venezuela, the work of my colleagues at the International Crisis Group. So checking our website, because we have just brilliant experts there with deep regional expertise.
For shallow expertise, the CIA fact book was something that high school students and others used for years, and it was enormously helpful. And of course, it's been pulled down by this administration, along with so many things that are just the National Weather Service. I mean, who knew? Just things that are plain old good gone. All right, in what world do you think we need I forget what it is that he's asking for, $1.5 trillion for the Defense Department?
It's really hard to see how that be justified. In part, I think, a through line in this president's approach to wielding executive power is the quest for theater, spectacle, trophy, monuments. And I think there's something psychologically appealing to him about it being the biggest or the best, right, in and of itself. But there's also we've seen this over the course of the last year or so, his predilection for military adventurism. And so that should be a concern that lies in the background with respect to any sort of a request for additional funds for the Pentagon. What is this exactly is this going to be used on, even in the near term?
Right. Yeah, I know how I'd be voting. It'd be a very swift thumbs down for sure. Well, listen, I really appreciate your time and your expertise. I'd love to do this again as we learn more about this unfolding disaster in that part of the world, and I fear in Cuba and other places in the future.
It was a real pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right, everybody. We will be back after a quick break. I have a taped interview coming. So what you're going to hear is me introducing people into the room for that taped interview when it starts. Don't go away.
Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody, come on in. It is Friday, April 3rd. Just a bit of news. Earlier today, Iran shot down a U.S. jet fighter. 2 pilots were lost. One has been recovered. The other is still lost. They were, of course, shot down by the non-existent anti-aircraft fire that's still in the hands of the Iranians after our president came on for 19 minutes and told the country they couldn't do this. They went and did it. So you can put that in this pack. And today he gave us a budget. And that budget is $1.5 trillion for the military, with huge cuts to things like FEMA and historically Black colleges and all of science and zeroed out things like help for low-income energy assistance in this year. So if budgets represent priorities and you are already confused or still confused about the priorities of this monster, I don't think you should be anymore. Anyway, I am joined today by the fabulous Andrea Pitzer. She is a journalist, a podcaster, an author of books. Her work is smart, it's honest, it's brave, and that's in character. She's been a let's say this right, a karate teacher, a portrait artist, a weightlifter. She's licensed to kill polar bears, although thankfully hasn't. But she is a brilliant writer of books like this one that you can see here, which is a history of global concentration camps. And we'll talk about in a minute because that's become frighteningly relevant to us here. Or as she puts it, it's a biography of a bad idea. And that bad idea is one that we seem to have taken. Andrea, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on, even if the reasons that we're talking to each other are not necessarily great reasons.
Well, I'll get to that too in a minute, but just let's start with and take off the table because I want to talk about many things. But before we began, you were telling us how we are already this kind of country where you see these camp systems.
Yeah, one of the things I found in writing the book was literally since the turn of the 20th century, more than 100 years ago, every time a country starts doing the kind of things that we're doing, you see people saying, well, no, our camps aren't like those other camps. We aren't like that. It's something really hard to see when you're on the inside of it, but much easier to see when you're looking from the outside. And just because of that perspective I've had from going around the world and seeing all these places where they have done this kind of thing, I have to say definitively that we have become a concentration camp society. We still have a lot we can do about it, but we're already there.
Yeah, and as you taught me the last time we talked, Americans hear concentration camps and they default to World War II movies and death camps that were the transformation of concentration camps made by Nazis. But the concentration camps themselves long predated World War II and are in fact completely like the thing in that we have housed prisoners in the Dilley facility in Texas, or that thing they call Alligator Alcatraz.
It's true. And the thing to keep in mind is that while those death camps that came in almost a decade into the start of the Third Reich that were developed and put in mid-war to allow the mass extermination in these extermination centers that were centered on genocide, the concentration camp system the Nazis had existed for almost a decade prior to that. Mm-hmm. And it's those earlier camps that were not death camps. That is the kind of history that we are repeating. And that is the kind of thing that has existed in a number of different places around the globe in that time. Yeah. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can, but there's a delay. So we are having some internet issues, but I think we'll get through them. So I want to ask you, I mean, you've studied these terrible things, but are you optimistic or pessimistic about America's future?
A friend of mine asked me that a little over a year ago, who was working on a book. And I would say the same thing now that I said to her then. I think that I am 55%, let's say, slightly optimistic. And it's a very weird push and pull because the reality is that we are at a place right now where things can go either way. We have an authoritarianism that is hardening and working very hard to tear down ways to resist. But we also have a tremendously powerful public presence of people doing just that on the streets across the country and national protests. We have a lower courts that are still defying the government openly. And as long as those things keep working, we have a really good chance to beat this, but it will require people to show up as they have been, but in even greater numbers. So I'm optimistic if Americans choose to act. And if they don't, then it could all be taken away. We've seen that again and again in history.
So I share your cautious optimism. I am more optimistic than I was a year ago, even though the Supreme Court gave Donald Trump a year to consolidate power, and he has used it to consolidate his power. But in that year, Americans learned to fight back and have shown up, and the courts have held. So I'm more optimistic than I was a year ago, even though we have the strongest, most powerful presidency. Yep.
Well, I will say, to agree with you on that front, to say that we are better placed than any society that I've looked at that has had these modern concentration camps. We are better placed because of the relative freedom that most Americans still have to make those changes. There's zero doubt in my mind that if we choose to act as a country, we can absolutely do it. And that would not have been true of many of these other places. So I don't think people should be feeling hopeless. I think they should be mobilizing and getting other people to show up.
So let's talk about that in a little more detail. Do you think if we show up, will be able to, let me say it this way, overturn this autocratic consolidation at the earliest possible opportunity?
Well, unfortunately, I think it's been going on actually for quite a long time.
Yep.
So we have a lot of work to do to overturn it, because you can trace it back to the war on terror stuff after 9/11, when we threw out a lot of our ideals and we started creating black sites and torturing people. You can run it farther back to when we started seeing immigrants demonized on a regular basis. When I grew up, I'm in my 50s, and I grew up in elementary school when the bicentennial happened. And I remember in West Virginia, which is not the most progressive state in the country, there was a celebration of immigrants who had built. And what it's turned into is the exact opposite in terms of what the government is saying today. So there's a lot more work we have to do to really change a number of our institutions and embrace a different kind of democracy than we have so far this century. But I do think that there are still a lot of things that we can interrupt. The damage is going to be there to things like research, scientific research, to universities, to public policy. The war damage from this, war of aggression we're doing in Iran that there was no reason to do. I think those are going to have a long tail toll. But in terms of reestablishing control over the government and beginning to undo all this, I think it can potentially happen in very quick order. And the disintegration of Trump himself as a person, I think, is increasing the likelihood that, even of things like impeachment, which I would have said a few months ago were much less likely. I think that there are a lot of possibilities on the table, but even if those big dramatic ones don't happen, I think that we're going to see the shifts in the election. I think the number of people that are saying things like abolish ICE, there's tremendous potential to make big changes very quickly.
So, you've watched these processes around the world. There are many people, Democrats, who counsel, if we win, for God's sake, look forward, pay no attention to what's happened before. Don't never impeach again. Look forward only. Don't hold anybody accountable. Look what happened the last time we tried to hold them accountable. Just move forward. I have my own thoughts about that, but I'd love to hear yours.
So there was some time in my life where I probably would have agreed with that. I think that what has happened in the last certainly 2 decades, I think, has made it clear that that is a terrible idea, because we have the direct example of Gitmo that I was referring to before, and Barack Obama coming in and saying, well, we tortured some folks, but we're going to just move on. We're not going to dwell in the past, right? We're going to move forward. And we saw that Gitmo wasn't closed. People who the government said and understood had tortured human beings, had set up these black sites, had sort of helped defeat and dismantle pieces of democracy among our allies that we pushed into hosting these sites. Much as I would say right now, we are pushing people who can be bribed or coerced into holding immigrant detainees on our behalf. So not only are we talking about a concentration camp system domestically, we're talking about doing it overseas, which is damaging to those countries as well as to our own democracy.
And even less
see
oversight. Yeah.
That Obama, who I think thought was it was less oversight and more potential harm. And in addition, that with Obama, I think he really thought, let's end this and move on, because he thought the country would coalesce and come together around it. But as Mark Fallon, who I interviewed for my book, who actually was one of the few people to stand up against torture at Gitmo right as it was being implemented, and paid a career cost for that he has said Obama thought that he was moving on, but all he was doing was hitting the pause button. And I think now we have seen the danger on letting the past be the past, not having that kind of accountability. And the answer is that stuff stays embedded in the foundations of the democracy that you build, and it weakens the future that you can have. And I think whether it's impeachment or whether it's another form, whether it's prosecutions, I think we are going to have accountability for some of what is happening now. There are literally war crimes underway overseas and domestically. We see court orders being violated on a regular basis. We see human rights abuses that are not in line with our laws or the treaties that we've made elsewhere. And I think if we just give all that a pass, then in 4 more years, even if we were to have great elections this time and in 2028, we have already seen it is possible for this to return and return again. And historically, from concentration camp societies, we know that when it comes back, it's worse. It gets worse over time. So that's my opinion, but you may differ.
No, I don't differ. And I have one additional reason, in addition to your wonderful ones, and that is it's related to Jeffrey Epstein. We have for a long time weakened our democracy by not holding people accountable, the powerful people accountable. And ordinary Americans like me are like, well, why do I have to play by the rules when they don't? Well, I mean, what is the use of this democracy if it was working for those guys up there and not the rest of us? This holds true not just for the truly horrid acts of torture, but for not a single banker being held accountable after 2008 when they destroyed the economy. Right? We don't hold powerful people to account in the same way. And ordinary Americans have figured it out. I would like to think that the impetus of all of this furor over Jeffrey Epstein was an actual passion to care for his victims, but I know that's not true. But it was ordinary Americans saying, what about all these fancy people getting away with all this stuff? When do we live in a country where the rule of law applies to everybody? And that's going to have to be true for the war crimes and for the, I live in Chicago. I watched what ICE did here. Those are crimes and they need to be held accountable for them. And Minnesota is suing the federal government in order to get the evidence so they can go after the killers of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. We need to do this stuff if we're going to heal as a nation.
I think so. And I think that the Good example is especially important, Renee Good, because they've literally said there doesn't even need to be an investigation, right? That is a tremendous level of hubris to say we're going to shoot an American citizen in the face and it doesn't need to be investigated. And in fact, you can't have the evidence and you can't even conduct an investigation at the state level. I think that kind of thing has to be addressed. But it does go, as you're saying, to this larger issue of the concentration camp society is never just about concentration camps, right? It's about how power is used. And what we have fostered in this country, I think it's very much, and this is aside from my expertise, so it's one step out of my wheelhouse, but it's still related, is this income inequality that we've seen. And so these power differentials that get put into the system. And when you have a billionaire class that can literally buy everything off, it's incredibly dangerous. And that what you described about the sort of people in the streets realizing that nobody is held to account, even as they themselves get held to account, right? But nobody powerful does. That was when I have visited different countries, when I visited Russia, when I visited places that weren't democracies, Myanmar. I was doing research for the book in a number of countries. The biggest difference I saw 15, 20 years ago between the U.S. and these other countries was that kind of everyday corruption where it was just understood you could not hold those people accountable, right? And I remember thinking at the time, there's corruption in the US, and certainly there's corruption that isn't caught, but we aren't there yet. But now when I look around, we are so much closer to that kind of thing. When the contracts are no bid contracts, they're given to somebody's friends. It looks like there's market timing at the highest levels. That all mixes in with these human rights offenses that are ICE operations or camps. And it's really, I think, one bigger thing. And that's another reason to have accountability, because there needs to be visible, more than just performative, but at the same time, really visible actions to show that people are accountable at the highest levels. And if they're not, then I don't think you can actually have a functioning democracy.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we got here from so many causes. Some of them are, social media showed up at a dangerous time in our country, and when politicians learn to weaponize hate in the way they have. But a Supreme Court that says, money is speech and unlimited money is okay and unlimited dark money is okay also undermines our faith that we can have a government that actually works. So we have a lot of work. My next question to you was like, okay, let's say we win these elections. Like, what are the things that we have to do to strengthen the democracy make it more legitimate in the eyes of its stakeholders or citizens, and to protect it from talented charlatans in the future.
So I think that there are a number of things, and first and foremost, I think, speaking from the concentration camp side, you have to stop a concentration camp society, you have to stop being willing to throw any community under the bus. And you may think, oh, well, this one, it's okay to do that to. These people came here illegally, or whatever thing, or trans people. We see the different groups that are targeted for hate right now. And you might think some of your listeners might say, well, that one kind of makes sense. But what I will tell you from my perspective of looking at this across 100 years is that as soon as you say it makes sense for that group to preferentially isolate them in some way, or everybody. And so the critical thing is first to stop that. The second thing I would say is you have to address the two sort of spokes. I'll have to come up with a better metaphor, but the two paths by which this happens. And the way it happens is by people who have a tremendous amount of money and power propagandizing in order to entrench that power and expand that power. And the way that they do it is by finding these cultural fissures through which they can motivate, terrorize, and infuriate the public. And that propaganda model, it just works. So we have to make it disadvantageous. We have to have the moneyed class to have less free money to do that with. So the billionaires to actually pay their fair share. And that has a double loop thing of everyday people start to see that accountability in force, right? Because you can't just say, we need to defend the vulnerable. I think that's important to say, but we also have to say, guess what? You're part of the vulnerable too. And we're actually defending everybody. And so you have to both remove the financial and power structures that allow that to happen. And you have to build guardrails in your democracy so that groups can't be targeted in these particular ways. And I think that that's a difficult thing to do in the US because of our tradition with free speech, which I also uphold. And I think as a journalist, I think is critical. But we see, as you've mentioned, social media is just one example, ways in which that stuff can be weaponized tremendously. And I saw that again and again around the globe. And so I think that we have to really provide resources for everybody across the country. And I would say that would be Medicare for all. I would say that would be some of the Medicaid protections that Kamala Harris was talking about in her campaign. And it might seem not intuitive that that helps build democracy, but it absolutely does if people are feeling that they are part of a democracy that is looking out for their interests and supporting them and their loved ones. Then they are more willing to engage in it in a civic sense and to not tolerate the kind of corruption when they see that there's channels that are addressing it. So that's a really big answer for you. But I think that the answer is definitely not to say, well, let's give in a little bit on this kind of hatefulness or that kind of hatefulness. Mm-hmm. I think the answer is actually to say, how do we build a democracy that protects every single American, except maybe the billionaires? We need to target them a little bit more.
Your answer strikes me as an answer that is true for civil society, regardless of its governing structure. If you want to have a cohesive big society, you have to do, it may not be a democracy, but you still have to have, you still have to treat people in a way that doesn't have them say that whatever the structure is isn't working for me. And you know, here, so I would add to the stuff you're talking about some of the actual reforms that we have to do to tweak the democracy itself, but the civil society stuff, the basic fairness, the treating everybody the same stuff goes at creating a cohesive society, one that's both harder to do, but also much harder to do badly in a big, diverse country like ours.
I think that we have to, I mean, one of the people that I just saw talking about this idea that I hadn't really thought of before in this context, but it actually makes a lot of sense, is what you see some of the Rahm Emanuel types doing right now, just to use a Chicago example, is what some people have termed white reconciliation, that you are so willing to try to reconcile with these lost, angry Trump voters, right? That you are actually getting rid of and harming some of your own base constituency. And anything you're doing where you're actually losing your base is not going to help build the larger democracy in the long run. Those estranged white voters cannot be wooed by doing harm to your own base. The way that they can be wooed is by providing a vision that they see will also benefit them. And the more time we stay stuck in these conversations around culture war conversations, and I'm not saying don't ever support different communities, because I absolutely stand up and support them. But the end result is you have to have a plurality of views in this democracy in which everybody understands they're getting something out of it. So you make the positive vision that people move toward. And there's specific things that you do that. I think a return of the fairness doctrine. I think promotion of educational options and funding for making different kinds of college available, actually looking at other programs for people that are looking for other routes. It really is a combination of a kind of economic security and accountability for everybody, while you simultaneously insist on protecting vulnerable groups. And it's going to play out different ways across the country. But I think we see both in my state of Virginia, where I am right now, Abigail Spanberger, and we see Zoran Mamdani, two very different places, one city, one state, but where you have seen executives elected to the senior positions of those polities really saying, we are going to improve this situation and things on affordability and things like with specific programs, right? With childcare, with rent, in all these different ways, while we simultaneously say, you know what, every New Yorker is a New Yorker and every Virginian is a Virginian. And I think sometimes when you see some of these pundits doing 4D chess, and then you wonder, like, what at the end of this have you done except maybe win an election? Elections are important, but if you don't have an agenda, you aren't going to be able to put in that agenda after the election anyway. And so my thought is build that movement, and then you will be able to actually achieve the things that will establish democracy more fully, because we have seen democracy collapse in shocking ways over the last year. Even as you and I remain optimistic about what the people can do, I don't think you or I either one, I'm just guessing, correct me if I'm wrong, but thought universities would crumble the way that they have. Thought that the military wouldn't stand up more to these changes that Hegseth has been making, that we wouldn't see more resignations, that we wouldn't see more of these kinds of things happening. And so I think the answer is, like, our institutions have to change. So when I see some centrist Democrats or Democratic leadership say in Congress saying things like we need to reform ICE, and then they make a list of things which are already existing for the most part, like covered under statutes already. Like, that's not actual reformation of ICE, right? No. And so one of the lines that I say that I think sometimes helps people see it is the answer in 1933 to Dachau, the correct answer was not better training for the guards. And so I think this approach that we reform things a little bit to get by and not make people upset is how we got where we are. So that's a very long answer to your short question.
No, it was brilliant. But look, when you're talking about this question, as you called it, white reconciliation, there is, I think it's legitimate for us to say, after the Civil War, we had a period of Reconstruction, and then the majorities in the North and the South got together and said, yeah, we really don't need to worry about any of that for another 100 years. We can go back and have Jim Crow and put the country back together and forget about this little dispute we had. And that is not a path that I think is, thank God, I don't think it's open to us, but it's also not a moral choice. It's not an ethical choice. It's not a choice that faces the future. It's not a strategic choice. In every way, it's the wrong choice, cruel as it is. And we've made that mistake before. It is legitimate to raise it now and say, let me give a different example, not from the U.S. In Israel, they had a prime minister who was trying to make peace, Yitzhak Rabin, and he was shot by the right wing, and the society was divided in half. And they said, oh, no, we have to reconcile and come together. And the right wing ate their lunch, and now we see what it's wrought in that country. right? So to the peacemakers on my side of the aisle, I want to say you can make peace, but you can't make peace by rolling over.
I think that the mistake is when, and we see this all the time, when you go in with concessions. You're leading with concessions, and that makes clear right from the start who has the actual power, right? If you are leading with giving things up, you're not controlling anything. You are completely ceding to your opposite side's arguments.
I've loved our conversation. Let's do it again, maybe with a better internet connection next time. Because
yeah, thank everybody for your patience today. Yeah,
no, a pleasure.
Chicago's Progressive Talk, WCPT 820, where facts matter.
Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
Well, the great Dean Baker is back. He is, of course, the senior economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. He has also been a huge help to us here on this show and everybody listening to understand what's going on with our economy and how our economy and what's going on in the government are related. Hi, Dean. How are you?
Hey, Edwin. Good. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm good. I am good. Although I'm mighty upset about the place our country finds itself.
So are we all.
We haven't yet fully felt, I think, the economic shocks of Trump's war, but inflation already feels high. It still feels high. What's it look like? What's going on?
Well, it's striking. We had data from before the war, and that was scary. I mean, so we were getting data on inflation from January and February, and it definitely looked like there was going to be an uptick. So what I'm referring to here are like at the wholesale level. So there was some of that showing up at the consumer price index, the retail level, but it was more at the wholesale level. We're looking at much higher inflation those months that you expect to be passed on because in general corporations don't eat it, so this is partly the tariffs, partly God knows what, but in any case, definitely seeing higher inflation down the road. Then, of course, we get the war starting in March and gas prices go through the roof, and that means that's going to be passed on. We're already hearing stories of companies having surcharges for shipping, higher shipping costs. We're going to see higher airfares. So it's going to be passed on in everything. So we're seeing a story of higher inflation, and that's coupled with a weaker labor market. We did get a relatively good jobs report on Friday, so that was mostly a good story. But that's against a backdrop where we're still seeing slower wage growth and a lot of other data just showing the labor market weakening, most importantly, at least in my view, very low quit rates. And I consider that a big deal because ordinarily we have millions of people quitting a job every month, getting a new job or looking to get a new job. And that's really fallen a lot, which suggests that people think their labor market prospects are pretty bad. And I highlight that because we look at the unemployment rate and we go, okay, well, that's 4.3%. That's better than where it was. It was 4.4 the prior month, so going the right direction. So you go, okay, well, that's 6 million people. But if you look at the people who are quitting their jobs, that's in a normal month, that's somewhere in the order of 3 or 4 million are quitting a job. And that means they could look for a new job. They're looking for a new job. They're quitting because they think their prospects are better elsewhere. And when you see that fall off, as we had, that means that people are at bad jobs but feel there are no alternatives. So we're looking at a situation of a weak labor market. I'm not going to say a horrible labor market, but a weak labor market and higher inflation. And that's just going to get worse due to the impact of the war. Again, we don't know how long it's going to be. We don't know what the end looks like, but clearly it's not a good story.
And the interest rates are not likely to go down no matter what President Trump says in this environment, are they?
No, and that's one of the things that hasn't gotten, to my view, the attention it deserved, that the mortgage rates had been falling. I think we actually have gotten a little under 6% briefly back in February, but now they're getting close to 7% again. And again, it's because of the war, because of people expecting inflation, and that's a bad story. I mean, I think all of us hope that we'd see rates fall, and it'd be easier for people to buy homes or refinance a mortgage, and that's not true for now. Again, who knows where we're going 6 months, a year down the road? But for now, at least, that's not a good story.
Oh, it's a terrible story. I mean, it's a terrible story not just for people in their homes and businesses want to borrow money, but I'm thinking of municipal debt. I'm just across. There's a lot of debt in this country at every level, and high interest rates coupled with inflation, coupled with an economy that's not growing, it is truly dangerous.
Yeah, it's one of these things you just wonder. Maybe we shouldn't try to get into Trump's head, but it just seems like all this hit him as a surprise. And he said repeatedly, I'm sure you've heard this. He said repeatedly that none of the experts thought that Iran would shut down the Straits of Hormuz, which on the one hand kind of amazes me he said that in the first place, because you didn't have to be an expert. I mean, I would never call myself an expert on the Middle East, but this has been something that's been talked about for decades, that Iran, if it were attacked, has the power to shut the Straits of Hormuz. I mean, and if they really are worried about their survival, yeah.
Everybody.
So it's incredible he would say that, but then he repeats it. And the reason for emphasizing that he repeats that is that's telling you that all of his aides, they aren't all idiots. I mean, Marco Rubio, I'm not going to say he's some great geopolitical genius, but he's not a moron. They can't tell him. They can't tell him that stop saying that because you look ridiculous. So what it means is we have a guy who clearly has no understanding of the situation he's facing, and he won't talk to anyone who does have an understanding, or maybe I should put it differently. The people who do have an understanding are scared to tell him that he's mistaken.
Well, sure. When you replace a president with a king, people tell the king what they need to know. Yeah, I mean, I remember this. Yeah. That's right. I mean, the president. Let me ask you an economics question that I don't. The president says, "Oh, we produce enough oil. We don't need any Gulf oil. So the countries that need it should go get it. By the way, if you don't have enough oil, buy it from us." And he says to Americans, "But don't worry, because we have enough, your prices won't go up." Well, I'm not even sure you need to take an economics class to know what's wrong with that.
No, it is kind of incredible. And again, I can't try to get into Donald Trump's head, but oil's a world market. So if the price of oil goes up in Europe, goes up in Japan, it goes up here because our companies are going to look to sell it there. Also, just, again, I have no idea what's in his head, but the way the oil market works, it's not as though all the oil from Texas goes to California. A lot of the oil from Texas goes to Europe, goes to other places. A lot of the oil from California comes from other places. So it's not. In principle, you could have everything go from the United States to the United States, but that isn't where we are now. And again,
wouldn't it be fun to see this president tell these oil companies they're not allowed to export oil? Oh, that would be a lot. That would be a lot of fun. Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe he'll do that. Again, someone would have to explain to him the situation. That. Well, I wouldn't say it's the problem because again, it's not as though you could just change the flows. You can over time, but you can't just say, oh, that oil that's going to Europe, that's going to Japan, that's all going to go to California. You can't. Well, you can say whatever you want, but you can't make that happen overnight. That's something that's months or years long process. And again, it would be really foolish to do it. I mean, it's one of these things. And Trump says we don't need anything from Canada. We get a lot of oil from Canada. Absolutely need it, but why would we not get it if that's the cheapest place to get it? Why on earth would again, it's one of these things like you could understand a national security argument. We don't want to be dependent on oil.
I think we tried that in the 1970s also, an oil export embargo. It didn't work very well. The markets are very skittish. I mean, I don't know if this is where this stands in history about volatility, but it feels pretty volatile, up a lot, down a lot. And that tells me that people often watch them. They say there's wisdom in markets, and you can watch them to learn a little bit about what a great majority of people think is really happening in the world. But it says to me that a great majority of people don't have a clue what's happening in the world.
Well, I think that's exactly right. Another part of the story, and I don't know if we'll ever be able to get the lowdowns on this, but there have been some big moves, big trades in advance of statements from Trump. So in particular, when he gave his, I'm trying to remember if it was a speech on Wednesday, he made some announcement suggesting that he was about to wind down the war. Yep. And that caused the market to rally, oil prices to fall, and there were big trades. So those weren't coincidences. Obviously, someone was clued in. And, for Trump, he doesn't even think about it. Or if he does think about it, it's just like, oh, yeah, why shouldn't I give my friends, some chance to make a lot of money? And of course, that comes at someone else's expense. So all the rest of us, if you're looking to buy into the market, well, someone beat you to it, and you just paid, 2% more for whatever stock you had to buy, or if it was oil, whatever. I mean, the point is someone's jumping ahead of you based on inside knowledge. And again, he if he doesn't actively cultivate that, he certainly isn't taking steps to prevent it.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up, Dean. I've talked to a lot of people about the corruption of this administration and things like the insider dealings or market manipulation. But you're an economist, so I get to talk to you about something a little different. What does it mean for the integrity of the markets themselves and their future and their efficiency and their ability to function like markets are supposed to function when the people who interact with them begin to think they're corrupt?
Well, it means you're paying a risk premium. So, I'm picking on Zimbabwe. I don't know why, but it's not known for being a particularly, reliable, trustworthy country. But you can make loans to Zimbabwe, companies in Zimbabwe, their government. You get a big premium on that because it is understood to be very risky. The United States was understood to be a country that had good institutions, and you had a fair deal that if you're going to put money, you want to invest 10,000, 100,000, whatever it might be in the U.S. stock market or bond market, that, was kind of a straight shot. You weren't going to be ripped off. And if there's an expectation that, you can't count on that because the laws, people do whatever they want here. There's insider trading. You can't count on anything. Well, that means when someone's looking to invest in the U.S., foreign or domestic, we talk about foreigners, but of course, same thing here. If I'm thinking, do I want my money in the U.S. stock market, or I could put it in Europe or Japan, wherever it might be, I go, well, I don't know what they're doing here. I might look to go to Europe, might look to go to Japan. So we will pay a premium. Our companies will pay a premium. Our government will pay a premium. Our governments, state and local governments, you mentioned that before. So everyone's going to have to pay much higher prices to borrow because they know these markets are not trustworthy.
I think that's terrifying, and even not just borrowing, but the values of equities will I guess be depressed a little bit because
sure
you don't know if the price is really based on performance or if the market's being gamed. I just think that this is taking trillions of dollars away from the American economy over time.
Yeah, well, we developed rules and reputation over decades, even century, if you want to say that. I mean, it wouldn't be wrong that, we're the gold standard, that we prosecute people who do insider trading. We police it. We have the Securities and Exchange Commission set up almost 100 years ago. Make sure that you don't have corrupt dealings. Companies have to file reports. It used to be quarterly. They are changing that. I don't know where that stands. They want to change it to biannually. So less frequently they have to report on their status. No one's inspecting it. They've made a big point, like we're not going to inspect it. And I don't say that, but they've hugely cut back their inspections and the prosecutions. They've become a joke. And in the event you are prosecuted, you toss a couple million over to Trump and he'll give you a pardon. So we made a point of building up. And it was bipartisan. This wasn't a Republican or Democratic thing. Everyone understood the value of having reputable markets and clear rule of law. And Trump is throwing that in the toilet. And we pay a big price insofar as people no longer view the United States as having a trustworthy market.
I'm not a big consumer of financial news. I mean, I'll read the news in the Wall Street Journal occasionally, but I don't read Barron's. I don't read a whole bunch of the, there are hundreds and hundreds of writers on Substack who follow the economy, who talk about the economy. And for years, this was a Republican world. But now, is that world concerned about what's happening to America's markets? Are we beginning to get investors saying, willing to push back and saying deregulation is one thing, but corruption is another?
Yeah, you definitely have people saying that, and again, a lot of people who are Republicans, people who even supported Trump. They're saying this, and they're very concerned about it. So you are seeing that. I don't know if you have the big money people sitting down and telling Trump that, hey, this is a problem. I mean, a lot of them, like you take Elon Musk, that he's just fine because Elon Musk, he's got his insider deals and he's going to get money contracts for SpaceX and whatever other company he wants money for. So he's pleased as punch. But you have a lot of other people that might be less closely tied in, and they are worried because they know there'll be long-term damage. And if they're not close to them, there'll be short-term damage for these people. So it is a clear problem. Now, we may see a blow-up. I don't want to be the one yelling that, world's about to collapse. I mean, I think I've been on your show before where I've been saying we have an AI bubble, and I think that will burst. And is that next week? Is it next month? Is it next year? Who knows? When I was talking about the housing bubble, I expected it to burst way before it did. It eventually burst and brought down the economy. The AI bubble probably won't be quite as bad, but it will be a big deal. But there's also, and I'll confess, I don't know the details, partly because it's not public, but you have a private credit market. These are private equity companies. They make loans that are not, I shouldn't say, I was going to say they're not on anyone's books. They're not publicly known. So I don't know how much, this private equity company has lent to, an AI company or a data set, whatever it might be. That's not public information. We know there's a lot of money out there, but the specific loans are all private. Anyhow, a lot of those are in trouble. We know that. Is it hundreds of billions? We don't know that. Is it all concentrated in, one or two big private equity companies? We don't know. But anyhow, that may well be something that blows up in the not distant future. And if that happens, that will really shake the markets and maybe cause some rethinking. Again, I don't have inside information, so I'm not going to tell you it's going to happen. I'm just mentioning that does seem a possibility.
Okay, I'm a little out of my depth here, Dean, but I'm going to ask this anyway and see if the question makes sense. So these private equity deals and the loans that are not public are very hard to value properly if you want to sell your loan, if you're in trouble, right. So there's really not going to be a market for them in the same way. So people who then need to raise money are going to be forced to sell the things where there is a market, and that's in the public markets. So the stock market, equities, I guess, in the public markets are going to pay almost a leveraged price to cover the need for funds when people get in trouble, when their money is in markets that aren't public and therefore hard to price. Is that right?
Yes. Well, that could be part of the story. It's more that you're going to have so the companies that might be in trouble, they're getting that money from like life insurance companies. They're, at the end of the day, it's, you and me, there's a lot of us that we might have money at stake and we don't realize that. So you have people that have a life insurance policy and the life insurance company lent it to a private equity company that has these huge loans outstanding to data centers or whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. So the question is, those can go bad. So, you're expecting, you have a life insurance policy, you're expecting to pay off in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, and they're now telling you, oh, no, you're out of luck because, the money went bad. Well, they owe it to you, so it's very similar to what happens with the bank, except this is all private. They're not insured. But, it's just like if you or I, we have $10,000 at our local bank and they go, hey, we made bad loans, we can't pay you back. Well, the FDIC will pay our deposits. In this case, there's no entity that in principle backstops to it. So, you have people that, it could be you or I, that we have a life insurance policy we're expecting to pay off, and now they're saying, oh, no, you're out of luck. Well, that's the problem. That's where it's likely to be a problem. There is also the case that they might do desperation sales of whatever assets they do have. So we could see that as well. But there also is the bottom line that if they're actually bankrupt, that they can't make good on their liabilities.
We're also, all this is happening in the midst of the baby boomers are moving off the stage. And so there's this intergenerational transfer of wealth going on. Not much in the way of an inheritance tax, but there's an intergenerational transfer of wealth. And yet younger Americans tell me that they have fewer opportunities than they think we had. And are they right about that? And how hard is it for them to, find and pay for decent housing, find a job that gives them health insurance? What's it like to be a young American?
Well, I think the contrast is certainly overblown. I think we're roughly the same age. Entering the labor market in the 70s, late 70s and early 80s was not a picnic. There was very high unemployment. We had decades of wage stagnation for the typical worker. So this idea that was some sort of golden age, that's an invention. I mean, you could argue that about our parents. People entered the labor market in the 50s and 60s. Then the unemployment rate was low. Wages were rising rapidly. That would have been accurate. But baby boomers did not have it great when we were entering the labor market. Now, what we did have, houses were relatively cheap. On the other hand, interest rates were through the roof. I remember first time I was in a position to buy a home, I got 10% mortgage. That was adjustable rate. If I'd gotten a fixed rate, probably would have been like 12%. So this, but I and others of our generation were lucky that we got homes and the price went up a lot. So that was definitely a good thing. But it was not like easy pickings, for us in our youth. But that's neither here nor there. The important point is, can young people today look to be able to buy a home and have decent jobs that they could afford health care, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a very mixed story. Wages are definitely higher, adjusting for inflation, than they were, say, 25, 30 years ago. I don't think there's any doubt. That's at the median. I'm not looking at the high end. That's the median. But health care is a struggle. Health care costs have vastly outpaced inflation, and house prices have outpaced inflation. So those are two really big things that, understandably people care about, they want, and it's hard for them. I think you have to talk about policies to try and address the situation. I think we could do it. I mean, in particular, healthcare, we can get costs down. Government could pick up a larger share of the burden. We could tell that story. Housing, I think prices are coming down. It takes time, though. I mean, we can make it happen faster, but I think if you look a few years down the road, my guess is house prices will be much more affordable than they are today. But again, this is all qualified. We don't know what Trump's going to do. But, if we just looked at a path from where we were before Trump took office, I would have said house prices were going to come down and be more affordable.
Yeah. And is that because there's more housing stock?
Yeah, so what happened, and I think people really have distorted the story. House prices did rise somewhat before the pandemic. I'm saying somewhat, I mean in real terms. So they outpaced inflation somewhat, not hugely. The pandemic, they went through the roof for obvious reasons. People were working from home. We've seen a huge increase in remote work, which has continued. That's great. And they needed more room, and they had the money because they weren't commuting. So we saw a huge increase in demand for housing, sent house prices through the roof. That's leveling off because we aren't seeing a growth in remote work. We see, that's being sustained. 20% or so of people work remotely. That's being sustained. But we are building more housing, and, prices have been falling in real terms, or had been. Again, where we go with Trump and his war and where this stuff ends up, I can't answer. But that had been what I was looking at. We were building more. We actually had been building a lot prior to the run-up in interest rates in 2022. We were building a lot. If we continued to build at that pace, that would have brought house prices down. We were getting back to that. So I think house prices will fall. They aren't going to plummet. We aren't looking at a crash situation, but it will become more manageable. And again, if we don't have this war going on, we'll see interest rates. We aren't going to get back to the 3% rates we had in the pandemic, but we might see interest rates get down to 5%, which would make things much more affordable for people.
A lot of people say that one of the biggest products that goes through the Gulf, other than petroleum, are the chemicals that everybody needs for fertilizers. Do you have any insight into what's going on in agriculture and what we can expect this year?
Yeah, that's a huge issue, which I think I and most people, most analysts, economists hadn't recognized what a large percent of the world's supply of chemicals for agricultural purposes do come from the Gulf region. And that's going to be a really bad story. So it doesn't hit immediately, of course, because it takes time for it to get to the destination, whether the farms in the Midwest or Latin America. But that's a really, really horrible story because, if we see our crop yields fall 10, 20%, then we're looking at big jumps in food prices. People, for the most part, aren't going to go hungry here. But you look at sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, this is subsistence for people. It's a really awful story. And again, it's one of these things. You just go, what were they talking about at the White House? Needless to say, this was not on their radar screen.
Or they didn't care, because how could closing the straits not been on their radar screen? I just don't believe that they didn't know it was possible. They can't be that stupid.
Well, I believe Trump didn't know. I'm sure there were, and Hegseth probably is no better than Trump. But, again, there were people in the room who surely know, but maybe they couldn't talk.
Yep. Well, Dean, what is, if you had to pick one ray of light for sort of some good news before you go, is there one?
Well, I'll give you one that I think is great news. It's a little longer term, but, we're all concerned about climate change because we believe in the world and reality. And my God, you couldn't do something better to push clean energy than what Trump's doing in the Gulf. Now, that's not my preferred route, but, everyone in the world is going, oh, my God, we don't want to be in this situation ever again. How quickly can we switch to wind, to solar, to electric vehicles? We were making that transition already. I mean, us less than Europe and China and other countries, but in a hyperdrive now.
Yeah, I think the rest of the world is. I think Trump will have us left behind there. But the American economy is stunningly resilient. I mean, we bounced back after COVID like nobody. And so maybe we will be able to make an energy transition that no one expects us to make and that the president doesn't want us to make because we are that creative. But we'll see.
We could do it. I mean, the thing is, he's trying to throw monkey wrenches. You saw he's giving $1 billion to a company. I think they're a Dutch company. It doesn't matter. A foreign company to not build wind energy. We're using our tax dollars to keep them from building clean energy.
Right, and to force them to invest in natural gas. Yeah, it's ridiculous. All right, well, I'm going to take that piece of good news and wish you a happy holiday season that we're in, and keep the faith, man. I'll talk to you soon. This saga is not over.
Yeah, well, let's hope next time we talk we have some better news. So, yeah, happy holidays to pass over to you too.
Thank you. Bye, Dean. Bye. All right, folks, we'll take a quick break and your calls when we come back.
Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
773-763-9278. 773-763-9278. I am taking your calls, and Jim is going to kick us off.
Hi, Edwin. Today's terrific guest today. One of them reminded me of an interview about 50 years ago. A contractor who built bomb shelters in California, of all places. Anyway, because we got it from $50,000 for the economy-sized bomb shelter to the more elaborate bomb shelter about $500,000. He's dead serious in this interview. At the end of the interview, the guy says, "If you got one," he goes, "You think I'm nuts?" Anyway, but all this talk about nuclear war. I agree. I mean, what's going to happen is everybody's going to figure it out because if you're suicidal, nobody can tell who's suicidal and who isn't. We'll never know that. And then Trump is under this ballroom. Apparently, he's building some kind of a weird bomb shelter for himself. And it reminds me of Cope, the beginning of Cope, when Bob Woodward interviewed him, and he articulated to Woodward perfectly what this disease could do and how dangerous it was. But that was in February. He does not open his yap until March when he put Spence and Pence. If I went into hiding in March, I remember March 12th or whatever that year was. But he could articulate it perfectly to Woodward. So my point is, maybe you got more information than we do that, the bombs are going to start falling. I don't know, But
you always call me with this interesting stuff. I hope I hope that's not right, but I do think he would.
I know you do. I know you do. But, no, you have to be crazy. The
Jim,
point is,
the other option is he barricades himself in there after he loses an election and says, "I'm still in charge."
That can be true. But the problem, it's really strange about authority, and I agree with one of your guests too. After 9/11, you could feel the authority kind of seeping into our society. I remember at the Board of Trade, I went to buy my cigars, and the day after, a girl who I talked to very cordially suddenly went, "You got your IDs, I see you know me for 10 years. What do you think I'm going to do?" My point is, people fall under authority. For some reason, they're attracted to authority. I mean, you can go on and on. You go to Lenin, you can go to Hitler, you can go to Napoleon, you go to a million places in history. But the point is, I've always liked to quote, there is no authority over reason. Reason is something we can do by ourselves, and there's no authority over reason. So we have to be reasonable in this and just pray to Almighty God that we have peace all over the world. And we drastically need peace. That's what shows me about these Republicans and HECSEP. Let's talk about peace. For Pete's sake, life is tough enough, Edmund. Without threats of war and all this insanity and build-ups and all this dough going into war. And what's he looking for, $1.5 trillion for the Pentagon? My God, we can't trust him with 50 cents in there. He'd steal it in a minute. I mean, it's absurd. Anyway, you're a great guest today. One was better than the other, and you have a great weekend. I pray for peace, and thank you, women. Take care.
As always, thank you. Brian, you're next. Hello, Brian.
Hey, good afternoon. I would like to point out that in this hot war we're in, we've got to keep in mind the other players, and that would be Israel, the Saudi royal family, and all the other Gulf state Arabs. And I would imagine a lot of money is going to be flowing into the Trump family coffers to bribe them to influence what Donald's future decisions are going to be. And we need to keep an eye out for this and be aware of it. Our media likes to keep everything us and them, keep it simple, but it's not that simple. I'm sure the king or this ruling prince of Saudi Arabia wants to have a say in what's going to end up happening in Iran. And I think also, we need to reexamine our entire relationship with the state of Israel. I've heard AOC just was quoted as saying that not another dollar should flow to the Israeli government, and I agree with her on that point. We've been giving them carte blanche for decades. The behavior of the current government is abysmal. They're currently engaged in land grabs in the West Bank. They've attacked Lebanon. They've pushed out nearly 1 million people out of their homes in Lebanon, all to make Israel safer, and nobody questions it. And then I bet you dollars to donuts before the year's out, there'll be a a funding bill put forward to give Israel another $50 billion or whatever. It's ridiculous. We have to stop this. If you want to stop the war, we got to get all the players in our minds and think about them and think about what the Israelis are doing. I'm sure Trump has listened to Bibi Netanyahu quite a bit, and he let him into this war. It's pretty obvious. And, the Democrats have a huge problem. We have all these leading Jewish Democrats, but they don't have much to say about Israel. It's just, let's just ignore it. We don't want to talk about it. I found it interesting. You talked to that first guest or the second guest about international law violations, but we never had time to talk about what the Israelis are doing to violate international law. That's a huge problem, and we got to stop this. And I just want to bring that to your attention.
I thank you for bringing it to my attention. My only challenge here is, I know that region well. I lived and worked there. I worked there 15 years. Worked there 15 years, in and out. A very complicated part of the world. Very, very complicated. But you've heard. I don't think you're right about American Jewish leaders not challenging what Israel's doing. They have. In fact, when Biden, for God's sake, went over there, he said, "Don't make the mistakes that we made after 9/11," and Israel did, absolutely. But you hear a lot of people. It's a tough road because this time we're in makes it very. What you did was perfectly fine, but it's very hard for people to be critical of Israel and not be anti-Semitic at the same time, and it's just hard. It's a painful, difficult time. But what's happened in Gaza, disproportionate. Probably we will see when people are allowed to look into it, evidence of real war crimes. What's going on in Lebanon, same thing, tragic, and the retribution that the government of Netanyahu thinks he's delivering to the neighbors where Hamas and Hezbollah, and to some extent the Houthis and Iran threatened them for years is disproportionate, dangerous, probably unlawful, and should not be supported. I couldn't agree with that more. That doesn't make Hezbollah or Hamas or the Houthis or Iran good actors in this world, but it does say something about you can defend yourselves without that level of slaughter, for sure. For sure.
And one other comment about nuclear weapons. I'm hearing reports, in right-wing media about as well. We've started the war. It's time to finish it. I believe First Mercanish on CNN was saying that it's time. We need to go in and get the enriched uranium. I mean, we've already started the war. Let's go for it all and stop the Iranians from obtaining their nuclear weapons. Well, if we're going to spend all that blood and treasure, I think we should demand the Israelis give up their nuclear weapons, and they should submit to international inspections. This whole primacy of Israel and the Christo-Judeo faction and this alliance, it's a load of horse manure in my book.
I got it. I mean, it is a country that's been threatened for years by neighbors, and they haven't, and whether they've never threatened to use that nuclear weapon. So I don't feel endangered by their nuclear weapon, but I want to make sure that proliferation doesn't happen. And proliferation scares me all around the world. And we should have fewer nuclear weapons. We let the agreement between us and Russia lapse, the last nuclear agreement. And those nuclear agreements took literally thousands of warheads, and off the table on this planet, and made the world safer, and we let them lapse. Trump let the last of them lapse. So these big nuclear arsenals in the world are ours and Russia's, and to some extent China's, and we aren't even talking about what we can do to make those safer and smaller.
Yeah, well, we got a lot to talk about, but I appreciate your show.
You bet. Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate it. Dave, you're next.
Hey, Edwin. Funny you were talking about bunkers and that. I read about a good week ago that the Pentagon, they're looking for contractors to build prefabricated bunkers to bring over to Iran for the troops. So might be getting heavier, and that, and these to be portable too, where they can move them along if they have to, and they wanted to get like in 30 days they want to get some kind of plans from different contractors. Anyway, but the Pentagon has added Operation and Fury to its casualty database as of yesterday, showing 365 U.S. troops wounded in action and 13 killed. So the update marks the first time the Department of Defense has publicly included Operation Epic Fury in its official casualty tracking system, offering the clearest snapshot yet of the human toll tied to this operations. And with,
the American toll tied for sure.
Right.
I mean,
right.
Yeah.
Well, and because they keep. Well, they used to do that in Vietnam. Body count.
I love your thoughts on this. I mean, I have callers. Americans are like Brian, the last caller, furious with the state of Israel for its for the destruction in Gaza and for what's going on in Lebanon, and to some extent for our involvement in Iran, although that's on us. It's such a dangerous part of the world. I wonder if we would be better off, all of us, if we shifted the dialogue from how many people we can blame for the terrible mess it is to we're going to look for people who will make peace and start to praise the peacemakers when we find them.
Yeah, go either from the blame game and let's see if we put the heads together and how we can solve to get out of there.
I mean,
right now,
because the people who are there are not peacemakers. They are not peacemakers. Netanyahu is not a peacemaker, right?
No,
I mean, and what's left of Hamas is barely relevant, but they're not interested in peace. What's left of Hezbollah, barely relevant, not interested in peace. The Iranians, I don't know what they're interested in, but right now we're not interested in peace. I just think we have to change our focus on who can beat each other up fastest and hardest is part of what got us here. It got us a mindset that says, let's use the weapons that we built. And it's different than how do we make this place safe? How do we make peace? And I just think we need to start making that. Like if somebody's not going to talk about that, we tell them to shut up. I'm not interested in how you can kill everybody. I'm interested in how you're going to make peace. And I think we have to sort of change the tone. And I wonder if you think that'll work.
That might be above my pay grade on that one. It's a good idea, but what I want to know is the fact of last week, too. North Korea conducting engine tests for missiles capable of targeting the U.S. mainland. They've been working on a solid fuel engine, and they've slowed up for a little bit right now, the delay because of either looking for a better, determined to develop a better engine, possibly with a Russian assistance. Now,
and it could have a nuclear weapon on it, and it could be flying our way. But if there's a love letter to Donald Trump in the front of it, they won't shoot it down. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Because it's like, how come we're not attacking North Korea? And you're doing everything. They're doing everything that we claimed Iran had done. And they haven't never made it no secret about wanting to do us. And then, like you said, it's the love letter thing. And
thank you, Dave. I appreciate your call as always.
All right, Edwin. I just thought it.
Yep, Paul, you're next.
Hey, Edwin. Well, let's change gears here to the Supreme Court. And I have a theory that I want to. You were talking about free speech, and it's astonishing that the Supreme Court took this long to decide that birthright citizenship is the constitutional thing, but birthright being right of soil, not birthright of blood. And it astonishes me that they didn't even mention those concepts, which are the only two concepts about birthright. Birthright citizenship is kind of a half a concept. But, Samuel Alito can enjoy his whatever tangents he wants to go on. He's a terrible justice, absolutely awful. But let me ask you this about free speech, because I have a theory about, and this pertains to Donald Trump and January 6th. There's a difference between, and we can see by the 9th and 10th Amendments, powers and rights. Okay, so powers are things the government can do. Rights apply to the people. Rights are, as I define them, a conditional removal of government power, points of conditional removal of government power. This is where the government has there are conditions on it, obviously. So rights belong to citizens. In other words, officers of the government do not have rights as officers. They have powers. So when Donald Trump said and they said of January 6th that the court ruled in Trump versus United States that his words were likely covered under the periphery of his core powers. But I would say no, because Donald Trump himself said, I have free speech rights to say what I said, which means he himself is identifying what he said in terms of, he said it as a citizen, not in the powers of his office. Otherwise, why would he need to go to the ellipse to talk to a crowd? If this were in the powers of his office, he wouldn't need to talk to other people about it. In fact, he tried to exercise the powers of the executive office to stop the certification of the electoral vote. He told Mike Pence, don't certify the vote. And Mike Pence called Dan Quayle and said, can I do that? And Dan Quayle said, hell no, you can't. So Donald Trump did try to exercise the powers of his office to stop the certification of the vote, but he couldn't. So he tried another way. He tried a way to use his free speech with other citizens. And he then is, as a private citizen, subject to the 1969 Brandenburg restrictions, which are if the speech may cause or lead to imminent threat of violence, it's not protected. And so I would say that within an hour, Donald Trump's speech that he claims was his free speech led to a riot at the Capitol. So I would say he stepped outside of the powers of his office when he said, and there was a public declaration, I have free speech rights, that he himself did not think that he was acting within the powers of his office. What do you think of that?
I think the courts agree with you. In fact, this week, a federal district judge, ruled that Donald Trump is not immune from civil claims that he incited his mob to attack that day on January 6th. That federal judge made the same argument, I think, that you were making, that his speech cannot reasonably be, he wrote this, I'm looking at it, can't reasonably be understood as falling within the outer perimeter of his presidential duties. Therefore, it's not covered by any official immunity act. So it's like an 80-page ruling. I haven't really read the whole thing yet because it's on my list and I just haven't gotten to it.
If I email you, will you send me that? I want to share this with my colleague. My colleague thought that my rationale was astonishingly brilliant for being a non-lawyer. But I want to show, if there's really a judge that agrees with me, I want to show this to Walt. But the other thing about this and why I came to this is, and I think you've had Christopher Armitage on your program, have you?
Sure.
Yeah, he was talking about state powers, and people talk about the supremacy clause as if it makes the government, so the federal government so powerful. But so much of what I've read, and Supreme Court rulings as well, the point is the 9th and 10th Amendments are also part of the Constitution. In other words, state powers are not wiped out. It says the powers not designated to the federal government are reserved for the states and the people. And rights not in, the enumeration of rights in the Ninth Amendment is blah, 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 shall not be construed to disparage any rights retained by the people. So in all of this, with respect to ICE, the states have a hell of a lot more power than the state officers have been taking into using, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, ask anybody who believes in civil rights if they didn't learn that the states have power for the last 50 years. The states have a lot of power, and the right wing has used it for years. And now they're like shocked that we learned something from them. I mean, well, it wasn't that long ago. You and I actually talked about this when it happened, when Biden was president, and the governor of Texas said, no, your federal troops can't come near the U.S. border. We are going to put our National Guard between the federal troops and the U.S. border and tell you to go away. And instead of Biden declaring okay, we're going to just fight you for it, he said, yeah, you know what, we got other things to fight. But no question, states have incredible powers in America, for good and for ill.
Well, and I think there was a period post-World War II where our consciousness, our American consciousness, became so federally oriented that we just presumed that the federal government was kind of the nanny state. We just presumed that they had all the powers, and I think a lot of people did. I think I had that mindset before I became more informed. And now we have other issues where we really do have to consider what the Constitution said. And I kind of, Madison's mentality would have been, in terms of powers, you can't do it unless you can only do it if the Constitution says you can. When in terms of rights, it says if the Constitution doesn't say you can't, you can. So he had a restriction on the powers. And the other thing I noticed about the 10th Amendment is it says the powers. It starts with a definite article, as if there's a limit. It's the powers. It doesn't just say powers. It says the powers.
Yeah. So, well, you remember I talked to a 10th Amendment scholar on this show once, and she I asked her about the 10th Amendment, and I said, look, it says that the powers that aren't reserved for the federal government are for the states and the people. And I asked her if any litigation ever about what "and the people" means in that context. She said, no, really not. I mean, I'd love to test that right now. Like, for instance, Paul, you and I are being cheated, right? We want to be heard on the question of whether the country goes to war. We want to be heard on the question of whether you can tax us and spend our money on, say, TSA agents during a government shutdown. But we have no representation because our representatives are not allowed to vote on these things because of the actions of the Speaker of the House. I would like to sue the Speaker of the House under my 10th Amendment, saying, look, I as a person have these rights, and but I can't find a lawyer who will take the case. If you're a lawyer out there and you're listening and you are willing to take that case, get in touch.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. But at this point, we are speaking academically on a Saturday afternoon. So.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to move on and get a couple more in before we go. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Steve. Hello, Steve.
Hello, Eldrin. This is Stephen Esplains. Yes, earlier you were talking about keeping people accountable after this administration is gone, and how over the years in American history, an American ethos of one of compassion and forgiveness, which started Civil War, where most of the Confederate officers were forgiven, and they weren't hung or they weren't put in prison. They lost some of their lands, and even at Appomattox, Grant let all the Confederate soldiers take their muskets home, which is probably an act of compassion and getting on with it. And then we forgave Nixon. We forgave Nixon. And in the 30s, the people tried to overtake Roosevelt. I think they were just hit on the hands, and they weren't put in prison. And it seems that we have this American tradition of forgive and forget. And going forward now, again, after these people have left the stage, should we come down with a hammer on all these people?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? It's a good question, and we're going to have to figure out what the right thing to do is. It's going to be a tough one. We did not allow any of those in the Civil War, those Southern leaders back into government, and that's in the 14th Amendment. And we tried to apply that same law to Donald Trump. Colorado did, and the Supreme Court said no. So it's a really interesting set of problems. You know, there's a difference between throwing everybody in jail and still holding them accountable other ways. The truth about this administration has to come out. And I think Americans are sick of a whole class of people, call them the Epstein class, call them the Davos class, of somehow living in a world where they don't have to abide by the same laws as the rest of us.
Yes. But I'm sorry. Excuse me.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah. I've always was kind of proud of the fact, like Lincoln in his second said, with malice towards no one and charity for all, which is a wonderful concept. And like I said, Grant let all the Confederate soldiers take their muskets and their horses, if they had some, to go back. And that's a wonderful. But the people in power need to answer. And
I agree with you. Look, after Lincoln said that, one of zealot for the lost cause, right, came and murdered him. So this malice towards none goes both ways, or it doesn't go at all. Hey, Ron, Steve, I want to give one more caller, David, just a little chance before we go. So thank you so much.
Oh,
all right, David, you got 30 seconds.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, it's interesting. The eye for an eye. You know, Christians, these fake Republican Christians, are supporting an eye for an eye, and they're not looking at, turning the other cheek. They're not looking at forgiveness, and this eye for an eye is showing up in Israeli politics, going after Gaza, going after Lebanon, going after Iran. So where's the new covenant, and why is the fake Christian Trump supporting an eye for an eye?
Yeah. All right, that's got to be our last word for the day, everybody. Thank you so much for spending time with me, as usual. And keep the faith. Have a happy holiday. Keep your eyes up. Look to the sky. Thank you. Bye.